Chapter 462. Standing on the edge of the cliff and looking at the clouds, Ning-Kei rarely said such serious words. At first, he hesitated because he was talking to the eldest brother, but then it became smoother and smoother. What others don't want me to do, what the law of the Tang Empire forbids me to do, and what morality forbids me to do, does it have anything to do with me? The eldest brother shook his head and said, "But there is no absolute freedom in the world. Everything, even the spirit, has its limits. If your freedom interferes with the freedom of others, or even the whole world is not free, then no one will let you be free." Ning-Kei said, "But you should have as much as you can." The eldest brother was puzzled and asked, "Why do you have to have more?" Ning-Kei said, "These things are no different from silver. They are all good things. Since they are good things, of course, the more the better. I don't believe in the saying that it is better to have nothing than to have too much." The eldest brother said, "But it requires absolute power. If you want to have the whole world, you need to have the power to match it. I have never seen such a person in my life." Ning-Kei said, "Senior brother, you are right. That is why we cultivate and why we become stronger." The eldest brother's voice was slightly bitter and he said helplessly, "That is not what I mean." Ning-Kei said with a smile, "Although we can't achieve it, we must yearn for it." The eldest brother looked at him and said, "You want to have absolute freedom, but you don't have the power to match it. That is why you came back to the academy today. Do you want to see the headmaster?" Ning-Kei looked at the clouds on the edge of the cliff and said, "I don't know what I will ask the headmaster if I see him. But since the headmaster doesn't want to see me, I have to think about these questions myself." Eldest brother thought of what Yisu had said in front of the small Taoist temple in Chang'an. He also thought of the black line in the past. He looked at Ning-Kei's thoughtful face and could not help but sigh softly. He felt that the mountain wind passing through the cliffs suddenly became a little cold. Different people have different freedom. Once these freedoms conflict with each other, there will be disputes. The law of the Tang Empire or the West Hill scriptures are the rules to solve these disputes. He looked at Ning-Kei and said calmly, "The Academy believes that the law of the Tang Empire is the most important thing in order to prevent the world from falling into chaos. No one can violate it, not even me. And as a disciple of the Academy, I will take the initiative to maintain the dignity of the law of the Tang Empire. I hope you can clearly understand this." Ning-Kei was not surprised to hear eldest brother's warning and nodded. Eldest brother looked at him and suddenly asked curiously, "What are you going to do next?" Ning-Kei was silent for a long time and then said, "I don't know either." Eldest senior brother asked in confusion, "Then what junior brother said to me earlier?" Ning-Kei turned to look at him and said, "Senior brother, I didn't say those words to ask for your consent or help. I just want to say that your idea is wrong." Eldest brother stared at him blankly for a long time, and then sighed with emotion. "Youngest brother, you are indeed better than me, better than Jun-Mo." Suddenly, a thin and long shadow appeared on the precipice. No one knew when second brother came here. He stepped on the wisteria that was about to rot on the ground and walked to the two people on the precipice. He looked at Ning-Kei with a stern expression and said, "Younger brother, you are right. The most important meaning of life is not victory but fighting. So if you want to fight, then fight." Ning-Kei looked at him and suddenly laughed. He said, "Second brother, you are also wrong." Eldest brother and second brother were stunned at the same time. They thought that youngest brother was indeed extraordinary and dared to point out the two senior brothers' mistakes at the same time. It should be known that no one in the back of the mountain of the academy had dared to do so over the years. Ning-Kei said calmly, "The most important meaning of life is not to fight." Second brother frowned and said, "Then what is it?" Ning-Kei said, "It is to fight and then win." Standing at the edge of the precipice, looking at the fading figure on the precipice and the corner of the black academy uniform blown by the autumn wind, Mr. First and Mr. Second, the most powerful people in the back of the mountain of the academy, were silent for a long time, as if they were still thinking about Ning-Kei's previous words and the hidden attitude in them. Second brother sighed and said, "Everyone thinks that youngest brother has the lowest state in the academy, but now it seems that his state is actually higher than ours." The state mentioned here did not refer to the state of cultivation, but the state of mind. The headmaster of the academy walked out of the cliff cave. Eldest brother and second brother stood on both sides and bowed respectfully. The headmaster of the academy walked to the edge of the cliff and watched Ning Ke walk down the stone path and disappear into the narrow gorge. His 2 white eyebrows slowly floated up and he smiled slightly, as if he was very satisfied with his youngest disciple. Eldest brother asked in distress, "Teacher, can hatred really not be eliminated?" The headmaster said, "Strong emotions such as love and hatred are the difference between human beings and beasts. It is the key to prove that one is a human being. If one can even get rid of these, what difference is there between him and beasts? People often say that those who do not hate lightly are usually ungrateful. This is the truth." Silly boy. There is no way to eliminate this feeling and this hatred will never end. How can it be so easily erased? The most important question is, why do we want to eliminate it? The headmaster of the academy's words still could not help eldest brother get rid of this lost emotion. After he left the small town, he had been living in the back of the mountain of the academy. When he traveled around the world, he served the headmaster. Occasionally, he traveled alone and had his own tasks. Thinking about it carefully, it seemed that he had no real experience in the world of mortals. Eldest brother sighed and said, "But when will revenge ever end?" The headmaster of the academy frowned slightly and said unhappily, "I told you long ago not to read those useless, boring, tasteless, and shameless scriptures of Buddhism. Now it seems that you are really confused." Eldest brother smiled bitterly, but in his heart, he thought that those scriptures were indeed interesting. The headmaster of the academy said, "Junemo, explain to your senior brother when will revenge ever end, lest he burrows into the pile of old books again and can't climb out for 3 or 4 years. Second brother answered in a low voice and looked at eldest brother seriously. He said, "Senior brother, if you don't want revenge to ever end, then you should kill all your enemies and cut the weeds at the roots. In this way, there will only be a few ghosts left in the world who can't take revenge, and the story of hatred will end here." This simple and plain words did not move eldest brother, but made him smile bitterly. He thought that such a method sounded like a villain and should not come from the academy. Second brother did not dare to guess eldest brother's mood at this time. He turned to look at the headmaster of the academy and said calmly, "Teacher, since youngest brother can't find evidence that Xiahou violated the law of the Tang Empire, what will he do?" The autumn wind blew on the headmaster's black robe. He looked at the distant Chang'an city and said with a smile, "I don't know either, but Ning Ke will probably give us a surprise. 2 years ago, the Tang censor Zhangyiqi died mysteriously outside the House of Red Sleeves. At that time it did not attract much attention. After the censor's wife's crying was suppressed by the prefectural magistrate of Chang'an city Shangguanyangyu, the case was closed. It was not until Lin Ling, the psyche master of the northern army of the Tang Empire, sneaked into Chang'an city to investigate and found the iron nail in the censor's body that the case was rediscovered by some bigwigs. Later, with the death of Chen Zixian, Yan Suqing and others, especially Gu Shi's death in Tuyang City, and the death of Huang Xing and Yu Shuizhu on the rainy street, the Tang Empire's military and many forces began to suspect Ning Quebec. However, just like His Majesty could not punish Xiahou many years ago, no one dared to accuse this student of the second floor of the academy, and the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy without evidence. Just because there was no evidence, it did not mean that it was not true. The rumors about Ning Ke's identity had spread among the upper class of Chang'an city, even out of the country. Many people firmly believed that he was the son of Lin Guangyuan, the Xianwei general who died tragically because of treason. Therefore, many people were guessing what Xiahou would do when he was about to retire and return to Chang'an and to take revenge after enduring for so many years. The old minister of offerings from a prominent family in Qinghe County came and hid in the censor's mansion. He squinted his deep and old eyes, calmly and attentively watching the direction of the wind in Chang'an city, guessing what might have happened. The Tang Empire's military was vigilantly watching the movements by the Yanming Lake. General Su Shi stood on the small building and looked indifferently at Chang'an city. As long as there was any unusual movement, he would not care about the academy and would directly send powerful cavalry to capture or kill Ning Ke, because he was above the law of the Tang Empire. The people in the palace were also watching and guessing. Even Yi Su, the successor of the Jishou Abbey, came to Chang'an city. These bigwigs all had rare wisdom and strategies in the world. They had terrifying intelligence sources and subordinates. However, even they could not predict Ninkei's next step. Although Ninkei's state had improved by leaps and bounds and he was already at the peak of the see-through state, he was still weak compared to General Xiahou, who was at the peak state of martial arts. Therefore, he could not assassinate him. No one had ever been able to find Xiahou's crimes and evidence. When those who had participated in the incident died one by one in Ninkei's hands, it was even more hopeless for him to reverse the verdict for the Xianwei general's mansion and use the law of the Tang Empire to bring Xiahou down. The most important problem was that both the emperor and the academy were willing to see Xiahou retire peacefully. Even if they did not stop Ninkei, they would definitely not help him. The dangers in Jianghu could not touch Xiahou's clothes, and the plots in the court could not touch Xiahou's indifferent expression. Ninkei could not assassinate Xiahou, so what could he do? After countless calculations, including the reactions of the academy, the imperial court, and the West Hill, the bigwigs in Chang and city finally came to a conclusion that made them feel at ease. Ninkei could do nothing, at least in this winter. It was still late autumn, and the cold winter had not arrived. General Xiahou would leave the imperial court in the middle of winter. Ninkei cultivated silently by the Yinming Lake, waiting for the arrival of winter. One day the yellow leaves fell like rain. Ninkei sat under a balding tree, and his knees were full of withered leaves. Yi Hongyu put down the scroll in her hand and looked at him. She said, "Even if you hide the fact that you have joined the devil until the end and turn it into a trump card, you can only scare Xiahou and not kill him." Ninkei looked at her and said, "I don't know what you are talking about. Fight and then win. You can change victory to victory." This was Lin Hai's original words. He posted it on Weibo. I liked it very much, so I stole it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 463. Since it was not a human language, he naturally could not understand it. Although Yi Hongyu spoke with a southern accent, it was a standard Central Plains language. Ninkei said that she was talking nonsense. It was not that he could not understand it, but he had to pretend not to understand it at this moment. He looked calm and even had a hint of doubt. But in fact, after hearing about joining the devil, his body had become as stiff as a block of wood. His heart seemed to have stopped beating. Yi Hongyu closed the book on the table so that the autumn wind would not disturb the paper sword in the book. She looked at him sitting under the tree and said, "If you become an actor, you can also earn money." Ninkei felt that she was very boring and waved his hand to ignore her. Yi Hongyu picked up the book and walked to the tree. She looked at him and said, "You and I have fought so many times in the house by the lake. Do you think that I can't tell the difference between the aura of heaven and earth condensed on the surface of a martial arts powerhouse, and the genuine qi in the body of the remnants of the devil's doctrine? Do you really think that I will believe that you really cultivated talisman and martial arts in the cliff cave of the academy in the spring? Or do you think that I am an idiot?" The Tao addict was naturally not an idiot. At this point there was no point in pretending not to understand. Ninkei remembered that the headmaster had once told him that youngest uncle had never let the enemy's weapon touch his clothes after joining the devil. He could not help but mock himself and think that his state was indeed too low. He raised his head and looked at Yi Hongyu. He said, "Even if you have guessed something, you should know that I will not admit anything. So there is no point in trying to test me with words." Yi Hongyu said, "I just don't understand. During the second half of the trip to the wilderness, you were always in my sight. When did you pick up the cultivation method of the devil's doctrine?" She looked down at him and continued expressionlessly, "What I want to know is, where did the devil's doctrine genuine qi in your body come from? Master Lotus? Or Mr. Ku?" Ninkei shook his head and said, "I don't understand what you are saying." Yi Hongyu frowned slightly and said, "Why are you still pretending at this point?" Ninkei said, "There are some things that need to be pretended until the end. Although you have been expelled from the West Hill Divine Palace, you have said that you will dedicate your life to Haotian. So why do you think that I will be stupid enough to admit anything in front of you and be remembered by you?" Yi Hongyu looked at him and said sarcastically, "Are you afraid?" Ninkei said, "Although I haven't seen much about the West Hill Divine Palace's attitude towards the remnants of the devil's doctrine, especially the horrible means of the judicial department, I know a lot about it." Yi Hongyu smiled mockingly and said, I didn't know that a disciple of the academy like you would be so timid. Without any evidence, as long as the headmaster of the academy is alive, who can do anything to you? Of course I understand. In this world power always speaks. When youngest uncle traveled the world, the West Hill Divine Palace did not even dare to let out a fart. This is the reason. Ninkei said, I am much weaker than youngest uncle. But as long as Haotian Taoism cannot suppress the academy, the headmaster of the academy will still exist in this world. No matter what you know, you can only pretend that you don't know, just like what I am doing now. Because no one can bear the consequences of the truth being exposed. Then he smiled and continued, but don't expect the current state of the world to tempt me to admit anything. Since the headmaster of the academy is not dead, the West Hill Divine Palace cannot do anything to me. There is no need for me to get into trouble. Yi Hongyu said, but I already know about this. When the headmaster of the academy dies, I will immediately prove to the world that you have joined the devil and then kill you. Since we first met in the wilderness, you have always said that you want to kill me, but you have never done so. Instead, you need my help now. So don't say such things in the future. Just do it directly. Ninkei looked at her and said, there is another thing that I have a completely different view from you. I don't think that the headmaster will die before me, so you will never be able to prove it. Hearing this, Yi Hongyu was deep in thought and kept silent for a long time. Ninkei stood up and brushed off the fallen leaves on his body. He walked out of the plum garden. When he reached the stone gate of the plum garden, he suddenly stopped and said, your brother has come to Chang'an. Yi Hongyu was speechless. She looked at his back and said in disbelief, he has not entered the Tang Empire all these years. Why would he suddenly come to Chang'an? You ask me, but who should I ask? Ninkei said. Yi Hongyu suddenly raised her eyebrows and looked at him with hidden anger. She said, why did you only tell me now? Ninkei turned around and looked at her. He said, I am now the master of Chang'an. Mr. Yisu is a guest and you are also a guest. There is no need for me to tell a guest that there is a new guest in this city. Even if you are brother and sister, it is my duty not to tell you. The reason why I am willing to tell you now is to make you happy. It is a kind of bribe. Yi Hongyu said with slight mockery, bribe me not to tell the West Hill that you have joined the devil? Ninkei said seriously, why do you have to think of people as so ugly? Even if you have guessed something and tell the West Hill, what can you do to me without evidence? Yi Hongyu looked at his serious expression and could not help but be startled. She said, then why did you bribe me? Ninkei asked, it is not against the rules for a talisman master to have a martial cultivator as his servant, even in a challenge. Yi Hongyu nodded and said, this is the rule of the cultivation world. Ninkei looked at her and said very seriously, then are you willing to be my servant and accompany me to kill Xiaohou? You know, that general is really not good. He did not wait for the word kill to come out of his mouth. Yi Hongyu opened the scroll in the book and touched the small paper sword with her fingers. We are just discussing. Why are you so angry? Ninkei pretended to be calm and said. Then, he hurried out of the plum garden like a frightened dog. Chang'an was a very majestic city. The golden wind and drizzle in the south would be clear here, and the cold wind and snow in the north would be gentle here. Those who were low and self-abased elsewhere would be confident here, and those who were arrogant elsewhere would often become quiet and peaceful here. The great divine priest of light who left Peach Mountain worked in a shop in this city for half a year. Yisu, the successor of Jishou Abbey, began to preach in a small Taoist temple. In the small Taoist temple, no one knew Yisu's identity. The skinny Taoist who presided over the Taoist temple still remembered the scene of his failure that day, and did not want to take him in at all. However, Yisu took out the Taoist book approved by the West Hill Divine Palace, and the skinny Taoist could not find any reason to refuse him to stay here. He did not need to pay for a room in the Taoist temple, but Yisu did not want to live like this. He calmly and undeniably took over the preaching work of the small Taoist temple. He left the Taoist temple early the next morning and distributed leaflets in the surrounding streets and alleys, summoning the neighbors to listen to him preach the true meaning of Haotian Taoism. Standing on the stone steps, Yisu began his work. His description of the West Hill scriptures was very clear, but also very boring. Words such as Haotian, equality, benevolence, and blessings appeared from time to time. However, there were very few people in the neighborhood, and they left very quickly. In the autumn afternoon, the door of the small Taoist temple was extremely deserted. A few sparrows paced under the stone steps, looking for food with their heads lowered. They wanted to survive the upcoming winter that was destined to be unbearable. They did not even notice that there was someone standing on the stone steps, so they did not show any fear. Yisu looked down at the sparrows under the stone steps and felt a little confused. Why did the people of Chang not care about the preaching of Haotian Taoism? Then he felt a lot of contempt in his heart. This was indeed a country of non-believers. They could not even understand the teachings that he preached. The skinny Taoist walked out with a bowl of noodles. Looking at Yisu's expression, he sighed and said, "Although I don't really understand, I can roughly guess that you must have learned in the West Hill. You might have even gone to the Revelation Institute to study. However, preaching is not easy, so you don't have to feel guilty." Yisu said expressionlessly, "I don't feel guilty for not playing the lute to a cow." The skinny Taoist gradually became familiar with him, and no longer felt inexplicable awe when he saw the Taoist bun on Yisu's head. He laughed and said, "You can't force a cow to drink water. You have to think of some ways." Yisu frowned slightly and said, "What right do these people have to trouble me?" The skinny Taoist said seriously, "All the people in the world are the people of Haotian Taoism. They should all feel the warmth of Haotian Taoism. Thousands of years ago, the ancestors of Haotian Taoism preached in the wilderness and went through many hardships. Do they also have to see if the other party is qualified when they preach?" Yisu looked at this ordinary-looking Taoist and suddenly felt that this person's expression was more determined than that of the West Hill divine priests. He could not help but be slightly startled. After a long silence he said, "I have learned." The skinny Taoist smiled and said, "Do you want to learn how to preach?" Haotian Taoism spread in all the countries in the world. The Taoist temples did not need to spend much effort at all. All the people were born as believers of the West Hill Divine Palace. Yisu had traveled around all the countries and had seen this for more than 10 years. That was why he encountered great difficulties in preaching in the neighborhood. He could not help but feel angry and confused. He frowned and said, "Do we have to pay attention to the method of preaching?" The skinny Taoist said, "According to the usual method, we will usually distribute food or wine after the preaching. When there is a festival, we will organize a gathering for the neighborhood. If we have enough funds, we will invite 2 singers from the musical house to sing Taoist songs. The effect will definitely be the best." Hearing this, Yisu flew into a rage and rebuked sternly, "Ridiculous! Preaching is such a sacred thing. How can it be turned into an exchange of benefits? How can such believers be pious?" The skinny Taoist looked at him as if he was looking at an idiot and said, "Haotian has given everything to the human world. This is the reward for us. That is why we believe in Haotian. Isn't this a natural thing? Why are you so agitated? If there is no benefit at all, who will believe in the religion? God loves the world. I often have a headache." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 464. Yisu had been cultivating in the Jisho Abbey since he was a child. After that, he traveled around many countries and saw that Haotian Taoism was highly respected. He always thought that it was natural and never thought that faith could be understood in such a way. He wanted to kill this blasphemous Taoist with one slap. However, he suddenly thought that although the skinny Taoist's words were unpleasant, he could not find anything wrong with them if he thought about it carefully. So he kept silent for a long time. The sparrows at the bottom of the stone steps woke up because of the stifling atmosphere. They chirped twice, flapped their wings, and ran away to hide in the shadows of the autumn trees. Yisu woke up from his silence and looked at the skinny Taoist expressionlessly. He said, "Please continue." The skinny Taoist looked at him and smiled. He said, "In fact, at least 90% of the Tangs are believers of Haotian Taoism. However, they are different from the believers in the South Jin Kingdom and the Kingdom of Song. They do not have the patience to participate in missionary activities. Therefore, if you want to strengthen their faith in Haotian, missionary activities are not the best way." Yisu said, Then what method should I use? The skinny Taoist said. The people of Haotian Taoism value morality, so they pay attention to the consistency of their words and actions. However, for missionary activities, words are never as good as actions. As the master of the abbey, if you can get close to your neighbors and take the initiative to help them when they are in trouble, such as carrying water and drying food for them, then through your daily words and actions, you can show Haotians kindness and love. This is the most effective way to teach the Tangs. Yisu was deep in thought. The skinny Taoist patted his shoulder with his empty hand and said, other than the great divine priest of West Hill, not many people can witness Haotian's miracles. Ordinary Taoists like us are the representatives of Haotian in the world. If ordinary people want to feel Haotian, they have to feel us. Yisu was enlightened and said, that makes sense. The skinny Taoist sighed and said, it has been 23 years since I left West Hill. Although the Tang Empire is not as glorious as other countries, I am happy to guard this small Taoist temple. I heard that in other countries, the Taoists are tyrannical and the envoys sent by the Divine Hall are even more arrogant and extravagant. How can people truly respect Haotian? The only thing left is fear. Those Taoists are not the representatives of Haotian, they are the shame of Haotian. Yisu did not want to discuss the affairs of Haotian Taoism in the secular world. He looked at the bowl of noodles in his hand and said, if you don't eat, the noodles will get cold. Only then did the skinny Taoist remember that he had a bowl of noodles in his hand. He quickly handed it to him and said, this is for you. If you don't eat your fill, you won't have the strength to preach. Yisu quietly looked at the bowl of noodles in his hand and suddenly said, I'll try your method. A drop of rain suddenly fell into the bowl of noodle soup. Yisu and the skinny Taoist looked up and saw raindrops falling from the sky. An autumn rain fell without warning. The late autumn rain was out of everyone's expectations. The intensity of the rain was even more rare. Some of the neighbors next to the small Taoist temple thought that the rainy season was over, so they didn't repair their roofs. The sudden attack of the rain caused the roof to leak. After eating the noodles, the autumn rain gradually stopped. The skinny Taoist brought Yisu and two little Taoist boys to the street and began to help the neighbors to drain the water and repair the roof. Yisu had done many things, such as freezing the world with a sword, laughing at the messengers of the underworld in his life, and ignoring all the trifles of the secular world above the clouds. However, he had never repaired the roof damaged by the autumn rain. So when he climbed up the stairs to the roof and began to clean and replace the black tiles, his movements seemed a little clumsy. However, he was after all the first person in the younger generation of Haotian Taoism. His sister Yi Hongyu, whom he ignored indifferently, was known as the Tao addict in the West Hill Divine Palace. So he became more and more skilled in removing the tiles and wiping the oars, and his speed became faster and faster. The neighbors below the wooden ladder who were responsible for helping him changed from 1 to 4, but they still couldn't keep up with his speed. Gradually, in the streets after the autumn rain, people subconsciously surrounded him. They looked at the flying tiles on the street and watched him smear the mortar like he was painting mountains and rivers. They let out exclamations from time to time. Hearing the exclamations from time to time in the streets, Yisu's face was expressionless. He didn't feel proud because of this, because this kind of thing wasn't difficult at all. He only calmly and silently removed the tiles and smeared the mortar. He just did it casually, just like what he did in the past. The puddles on the street evaporated into steam by the autumn sun, shrouding the houses. The trees that had lost most of their leaves dozed off in boredom by the street. People looked at the secular Taoists from the small Taoist temple on the eaves and enjoyed the scene in front of them, so they didn't notice the scene on the street. A plump figure walked out of the water vapor formed by the rainwater. Chun Pippi walked along the stone street, stepping on the rainwater, and walked to the periphery of the crowd. He looked up and squinted at the figure on the eaves. It didn't take long for him to recognize the person's face. His originally half-squinted eyes suddenly opened wide. The rims of his eyes red, and tears flowed down. He looked at Yisu on the roof and shouted in a trembling voice, "Senior brother." Yisu was on the roof, using bamboo ropes to tie some wooden sticks that had been separated from the eaves. Hearing the voice from outside the crowd below, he slowly turned his head. He looked at the fat young man outside the crowd, and an extremely sincere smile appeared on his usually emotionless face. He said happily, "You've come?" Chan Pippi looked at Yisu on the roof and said with tears streaming down his face, "Senior brother. What happened to you? Have you also been expelled from Taoism? Is that person really so cruel?" Yisu's expression was slightly stiff, as if he had become a gecko on the roof that had been dried by the sun. Chan Pippi was still sad, looking at him with tears streaming down his face. Then he noticed that senior brother Yisu's left foot on the wooden ladder didn't seem to touch the surface of the ladder at all. Then he noticed that the clear sunlight after the rain sprinkled on Yisu's light white robe, emitting a very faint and clean luster, like the luster of jade. Chan Pippi then realized that senior brother's state was much higher than when he was in the temple. What shocked him even more was that senior brother was in some kind of turning point at this moment. The small Taoist temple was facing the street, with an archway and eaves, and there was a shadow in the sunlight after the rain. The two stood in the shadow. Yisu looked at Chan Pippi's round face and let out a sigh in his heart. Chan Pippi looked at the faint luster on senior brother's body, suppressing the shock and fear in his heart, and said in a trembling voice, "Senior brother, what medicine did you take to get into such a situation?" "I have been keeping the heavenly power pill. If you really want to try to break the realm, you must tell me first, don't eat it blindly." In the path of cultivation, the further one went, the more difficult it would be. Just like climbing a dangerous peak, the last few steps were always the most difficult distance. As the successor of Jisho Abbey, Yisu had already walked to the deepest part of the path of cultivation more than 10 years ago. It was easier said than done to go further on this foundation. So when Chan Pippi looked at Yisu on the roof, who was stepping on the wooden ladder as if he was stepping on flowing clouds, and his robe was faintly shining, he thought that Yisu must have taken a shortcut. Of course, Yisu did not take medicine, not even the most precious pills of Jisho Abbey, because since the beginning of cultivation, he had always believed that once a cultivator relied on the assistance of external forces, then he would never have a chance to reach the real shore in his life. It was not until Chan Pippi said it twice in a row that he realized something was wrong. Standing in the shadow of the small Taoist temple, Yisu silently looked at the houses and markets near and far. He silently felt his Taoist heart, and found that his state, which had been rigid for more than 10 years, actually trembled and a crack appeared. He could not help but be shocked speechless. Chang'an was indeed not an ordinary city. At this moment, the nameless small Taoist temple welcomed another guest. This guest was a young girl in a green Taoist robe. Yi Hongyu looked at her brother on the stone steps, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Then her eyes turned red, and 2 streaks of tears flowed down her beautiful face silently. Yisu looked at his sister under the stone steps and frowned slightly. He said with some disgust, "Why are you crying?" Yi Hongyu's clear eyes overflowed with more tears, but she did not reach out to wipe them away. Instead, she looked at him stubbornly and discontentedly and said, "When he cries, you are moved. When I cry, you scold me." Yisu's frown deepened a little. The only thing that could compare to Haoyin's divine light was a human's vision, which could focus on one point and illuminate the world she wanted to see. Yi Hongyu looked at her brother with grievance and stubbornness, like a little girl who was scolded by her brother for stealing her roasted sweet potato. Her gaze fell on Chan Pippi, full of hatred. Chan Pippi lowered his head even more obediently. Yisu looked at her coldly and said, "Who are you? How dare you stare at my younger brother so rudely? If you do this again, I will dig your eyes out." Yi Hongyu did not seem to hear what he said. She still looked at Chan Pippi with hatred, as if she was looking at a dead man. However, her eyes were not dug out because Chan Pippi, who was extremely guilty, spoke at the right time and dissolved the awkwardness in front of the stone steps of the small Taoist temple. Yisu looked at Chan Pippi and said with a smile, "I haven't seen my teacher for some time. I think he should still be in the South Sea. As for why I came to Chang, and there is naturally another reason." Chan Pippi asked curiously, "Senior brother, what reason?" Yisu said, "I came to see Xia Ho." After a short pause, he looked at Chan Pippi and said calmly, "And also to see Ning Quebec." He was the successor of Jisho Abbey and a world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism. Now he did not cultivate outside the world, but stepped into the mortal world and came to Chang, and for such a simple reason. If the rumor was true, If Ningke was really the son of Xianwei General Lin Guangyan, then he was very likely to be the son of Yama that the divine priest of light had mentioned. Although Haotian Taoism denied the divine priest of light's opinion more than a decade ago, and the bloody storm did not last until the end, Yisu did not believe it, because he was on the other side of the black line that year when the omen appeared. A friend has come from afar. I want to receive him. I hope I can drink happily. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 465. Yisu said to Chan Pippi, I came to Chang and to cultivate in the human realm. It's better not to see each other. But if you really want to come, then come. Chan Pippi asked, Senior brother, when will you return to the temple? Yisu frowned slightly, not because there was anything wrong with the question, but because it reminded him of the most troublesome problem of Haotian Taoism in the past decade. He looked at Chan Pippi and scolded him coldly. Then when will you go back? Chan Pippi was speechless and said awkwardly, I have to ask my teacher. Then go ahead. Yisu looked at him expressionlessly and said, Tell me when you have the answer. Chan Pippi was chased out of the small Taoist temple. Yisu waved his sleeves and walked into the temple. Yi Hongyu followed behind him quietly. Even though she had just been scolded, she still could not suppress the joy and mockery on her face. Her smile did not disappear even when she walked into the room. Yisu walked to the window and sat down. He looked back at her and frowned slightly, as if he was unhappy. Yi Hongyu stopped smiling and looked at her brother stubbornly and calmly. She did not want to leave. To her surprise, Yisu did not reprimand her. Instead, he said indifferently, leaving Peach Mountain might be a little less resolute, but it is a good choice. The great divine priest of judgment is an idiot who has been soaked in the dirty water of the secluded prison. We cannot tolerate him, let alone bow our heads. Yi Hongyu said quietly, I understand. Yisu looked at her peaceful expression and said after a long silence, I hope you can be stronger than me in the future. But you need to prove it yourself. Yi Hongyu pursed her lips and said, I will prove it to my brother. Yisu seemed to be satisfied with her answer and nodded. Pippi will become the master of Haotian Taoism in the future. He needs the help of a true powerhouse. I believe you will not disappoint me. Hearing this, Yi Hongyu pursed her lips even tighter and lowered her head, refusing to respond. Because of her silence, Yisu slowly raised his eyebrows like two emotionless Taoist swords. He said coldly, Don't think that I don't know what you are trying to do when you secretly provoked my younger brother to leave the temple. Yi Hongyu looked up at him expressionlessly and said, Haotian Taoism should have been yours. Yisu's voice was as cold as ice. Say that again? So what if I say it 10,000 times? Brother, you are the world wayfarer of Haotian Taoism. You will definitely become a saint. Haotian Taoism is destined to be passed on to you. Yi Hongyu said stubbornly, and I didn't say or do anything back then. I only told him that as long as he stayed in Haotian Taoism, the Abbey Dean would definitely pass on Haotian Taoism to him. Yisu scolded sternly. Pippi was still a child at that time. How could you say such things to him? This is the truth. Can't a child accept the truth? Yi Hongyu said, I was also a child then. I knew the truth. I really could not accept the truth, so I wanted to change something. Chan Pippi also knew that this was the truth, so he felt guilty. He felt that he had let you down. That was why he would never be able to defeat me. That was why he fled the Jisho Abbey after I said those words. Her voice was very calm and her narration was very clear. Although what she talked about was related to the most important matter of Haotian Taoism's future, she did not show any fear. The expression on Yisu's face became more and more strange. It was not anger, but calmness to the extreme. Even his voice was extremely calm. Have you ever thought about the reason for his guilt? This voice was not the frozen surface of the lake, but the quiet water in a deep well. Younger brother felt guilty because he was kind. He respected and loved me, but he found out that master had decided to pass on Haotian Taoism to him. That was why he was sad and left. Yisu looked at his sister expressionlessly and said, You knew what he would do if you said that, but you still said it. You were taking advantage of his kindness and respect for me. Yi Hongyu said expressionlessly, so what? Nothing. Yisu slowly raised his right hand. His white robe that was stained with rainwater and mud slid down his arm. He slapped Yi Hongyu's head with his palm. Yi Hongyu did not close her eyes. She stubbornly opened them and looked at her brother in front of her. Looking at the falling palm, there was only calmness in her bright eyes. Yisu's heart softened a little. The pity that he had forcibly erased in his heart reappeared. His palm gradually slowed down and finally fell weakly on the desk in front of the window. He let out a sigh. The sigh was filled with helplessness, regret, and guilt towards Haotian Taoism. Yisu's palm fell on the desk and trembled slightly. It seemed to be powerless, but in fact, it contained the cultivation and state of this peerless powerhouse of Haotian Taoism. With this disappointed sigh, countless cracks suddenly appeared on the desk. Then the cracks spread to the legs of the desk. Cracks also appeared on the bluestone floor, followed by the corner of the wall. The cracks climbed up the wall, and the bright paper of the window also began to crack. In the end, the cracks reached the beams. The desk broke into hundreds of small wooden pieces and fell to the ground. The legs of the desk broke into even thinner pieces and fell to the ground. The cracks on the bluestone floor deepened like a black abyss. The skin of the wall peeled off, the paper of the window floated away, and the beams squeaked and then broke in the middle. The desk collapsed. The ground cracked. The wall collapsed. The beam broke. In the loud crash, the remote house of the Taoist temple collapsed like a building block. Smoke and dust filled the air. The cracks continued to spread outwards and cut the rest of the buildings of the Taoist temple into pieces. The entire building of the small Taoist temple collapsed one after another in the smoke and dust. Fortunately, the lines of cracks that destroyed the walls and beams were extremely magical. They cut the hard and heavy building materials into pieces and collapsed according to some mysterious law of space cutting. Therefore, the people in the house were not smashed to death. The air after the rain was originally very fresh, but at this moment, the small Taoist temple was covered in smoke and dust. The skinny Taoist and 2 Taoist children were covered in dust. They climbed out of the ruins in an extremely pathetic manner. They covered their noses with their sleeves and coughed continuously. They looked extremely miserable. Yisu stood quietly among the bricks and wood. Dust and debris surrounded him, but his eyebrows and clothes were still so clean, without a speck of dust. When he was willing, he could climb the ladder, remove the tiles, and fix the eaves. He could be covered in rain and mud. When he was unwilling, even if the sky was filled with mud, it would not be able to touch a corner of his clothes. After all, you are my sister. Don't force me to kill you. Yisu looked at Yi Hongyu and said calmly, if you insist on standing in front of me with this stubborn attitude, I really don't know what will happen next. Yi Hongyu wiped away the tears and dirt on her face. She looked at him and said hatefully, brother, one day, I will be stronger than you. When that time comes, you will no longer be able to kill me. I will stand in front of you again and insist on taking back what belongs to you. After saying this, she turned around and left the small Taoist temple. Yisu looked at her back as she disappeared outside the monastery. He remained silent. What the hell is going on? The skinny Taoist pounded his chest and stamped his feet in pain. He looked at the small Taoist temple that had turned into ruins in front of him and thought of how he had saved and worked hard for the past few decades. He thought of how he begged everywhere for alms. His body trembled and his voice was filled with despair and sorrow. Yisu frowned slightly and looked back at him. He said, I will pay for you to build another one. Is this about money? Is this about money? The skinny Taoist was filled with grief and anger. He clutched his robe tightly to prevent himself from dying from heartache. He shouted in a hoarse voice, I bought every brick and every piece of wood in this Taoist temple with my own hands. I know where they used to be. But what about now? Now there is nothing left. I have forgotten where they should be. Is this about money? These are my lives. Is that something that money can buy? Yisu looked at the bricks and wood that had been cut into tiny pieces. After a moment of silence, he said, You are right. The newly bought bricks and wood can only build a new Taoist temple. Once the old is destroyed, it cannot be returned. There is no such thing as rebirth in this world. There is only a new life. After saying this, His expression stiffened. He stood in the ruins and did not move anymore. Yisu did not know why this small Taoist temple that had already been reduced to ruins could make him feel such emotions and say such words unconsciously. He only knew that ever since he traveled through many countries and broke through the barrier of life and death, his state had become perfect. His state that was as calm as a mountain showed signs of loosening after the slight tremors earlier. The skinny Taoist did not know his current state. Seeing that he was silent, he thought that he did not want to cause trouble. He could not help but feel even more angry. He wiped away his tears and brought the Taoist child to the ruins, hoping to find something useful. The collapse of the small Taoist temple caused quite a commotion. The neighbors quickly rushed over. Looking at the tragic scene of the ruins, they discussed in low voices and returned to their houses to get tools to help. Many of the neighbors' houses were damaged by the storm. However, they thought of the skinny Taoist's old age and the Taoist child's weak body. How could they care about their own matters? The previously tragic Taoist temple suddenly became a bustling construction site. Although it was impossible to rebuild a Taoist temple in such a short period of time, the loud chants and the laughter of the people seemed to indicate that the small Taoist temple would be restored to its original state in the near future. The skinny Taoist wiped away his tears and bowed in thanks. His face was full of sincere smiles. It was almost dusk. Yisu woke up. He looked at the ordinary figures in front of him who were busy. He looked at the smiles on their faces and thought of the words the skinny Taoist had said. He was deep in thought. The skinny Taoist walked in front of him and glared at him. He wanted to scold him but subconsciously did not dare to. He thought of what the skinny Taoist said when the Taoist temple collapsed and could not help but rub his hands nervously. He asked, "Are you really willing to pay?" Yisu looked at him and said seriously, "If you are willing, I can build a divine hall for you. Tomorrow is Saturday off. I wish everyone a happy weekend." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 466. At the back of the mountain of the academy, second brother stood in front of the waterfall, listening to the thunderous sound of water and looking at the splashing mist. After a long silence he said, "I heard that his building collapsed." Eldest brother stood beside him and sighed. It's his lucky chance that he came to Chang'an. Don't envy him. Second brother slightly raised his eyebrows and said, "Senior brother, why should I envy him?" Chang'an City by the Yinming Lake. There was a big earthen urn on the dining table, in which was a milky white mutton giblet soup. The verdant coriander was smoked by the heat of the mutton soup, and the aroma immediately filled the room. Ningke took the chopsticks and used the tips of the chopsticks to break the fermented bean curd in the plate. Sang Sang peeled the garlic and mashed it beside him. The big black horse was in the garden, watching the movement in the room through the doorsill. Its eyes were wide open and its nostrils were wide open. No one knew whether it was curious or greedy for the mutton giblets in the pot. I heard that the small Taoist temple where Yisu lived collapsed this afternoon. Ningke paused for a moment and couldn't help laughing. He said, "I heard that." After second brother heard about it, he stood in front of the waterfall for a long time and finally smashed his own courtyard. Sang Sang raised her head and looked at him in confusion. She had been to the small courtyard in the back of the mountain of the academy. Thinking that the quiet courtyard had become a ruin, she couldn't help feeling a little pity and asked, "Why?" Ningke shook his head and said, "Who knows what second brother and Yisu are thinking? I often think that people who have cultivated to their state will basically become lunatics." The small Taoist temple collapsed, and Yisu seemed to understand something. Second brother smashed his own courtyard. Maybe he also wanted to understand something? Although Sang Sang had now officially started cultivating, she still couldn't completely understand the thinking of those grand cultivators in the knowing destiny state. She thought that young master was right, they were really a group of lunatics. When the mutton giblet soup gradually became cold, the meat gradually disappeared, and the sauce on the plate gradually disappeared, Yi Hongyu finally returned to the Yanming Lake. Sang Sang went to pack her clothes, leaving only Ningke in the room. Ningke watched her walk in and said, "Why did you come back so late? By the way, although you don't pay the rent, shouldn't you do more housework?" Yi Hongyu looked at the leftovers on the table and said with a frown, "You have maids and stewards." Ning Ke said with a smile, "How can it be as happy as letting the Tao addict wash the dishes and bring water for me? The divine priest of light used to work in my shop. You can learn about the glorious tradition of the West Hill Divine Palace. In the future, when this gets out, it will be a good story for the Ning family." Yi Hongyu frowned even more and sat down without saying a word. Looking at her expression, Ning Ke guessed that she was in a bad mood. But he did not restrain himself and continued, "Speaking of which, I thought your brother would at least treat you to a meal." Yi Hongyu looked at him quietly and said, "It seems that you plan to live a long life in Chang'an. But have you ever thought that the world will not allow you to live like this?" Ning Ke smiled and said, "I am a Tang and a disciple of the second floor of the academy. I can't imagine who would be stupid enough to disturb my life. What if you are the son of Hades?" Yi Hongyu looked at him, her bright eyes full of mockery and coldness. Ning Ke was slightly startled. In the conversation a few days ago, Yi Hongyu directly exposed the fact that he had joined the devil, and now she mentioned such a possible fact so casually. "I really don't know what you are talking about," he said. Yi Hongyu said, "If the rumors are true, and you are the son of the Xianwei general of the Tang Empire, then you are the dark shadow that the divine priest of light saw in the eyes of the divine priest of light." Now, there are probably few people who still remember that incident, but how can I forget it? Do you believe it? Ning Ke looked into her eyes and asked seriously. Yi Hongyu thought for a while and shook her head. Ning Ke relaxed slightly and said, "Why don't you believe it?" Yi Hongyu said, "It's true." Ning Ke raised his right thumb and praised sincerely, "You have the best intuition. Come. Please eat some mutton giblets. I have some hidden in the kitchen, just to show my respect to you." Yi Hongyu did not smile. She looked at him and said, "I don't believe it, but it doesn't mean that the Divine Hall doesn't believe it. My brother appeared in Chang, and to pay attention to Xiaohogui, but I believe that he actually came to see you." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "I have heard some things. Sang also learned some secrets from Wei Guangming. Since the West Hill Divine Palace stopped this matter and imprisoned Wei Guangming for more than 10 years, it means that Haotian Taoism does not believe in the story of the son of Yama. Even if the Divine Hall doesn't believe it, it doesn't mean that the Buddhism sect doesn't believe it," Yi Hongyu said. Ning Ke thought of the two sadhus he met on the streets of Chang, and that spring morning. They were Master Daosher from the Xiankong Temple in the unknown place. He thought of the conversation he had with the stone Buddha in front of the lonely grave in the spiritual world, especially the obscure parts of the conversation. He could not help but frown and remain silent. "Let's not talk about these boring things. Let's eat mutton giblets first." He looked at Yi Hongyu and smiled. He said, "Mutton giblets must be eaten while it's hot." Yi Hongyu frowned and said, "It's not the winter solstice now. Why do we eat mutton giblets soup? Who said that mutton giblets must be eaten on the winter solstice? Who said that you can't stab someone to death without a spearhead?" Ning Ke's words seemed a little strange, at least to Yi Hongyu. There was a hidden meaning in it that only he could understand. After a moment of silence he said, "And I may not have time on the winter solstice." Although Yi Hongyu was forced to leave Peach Mountain, as the Grand Master of the Judicial Department, she still had her own sources of information in Chang'an. Therefore, when she heard Ning Ke's words, she could not help but frown deeply again. Her eyes were gradually filled with confusion and surprise. The winter solstice was the day of Xiaoho's glorious return. Time passed, and the autumn air gradually faded. A small Taoist temple in Chang'an collapsed. Warm-hearted neighbors helped the people in the temple to rebuild their houses. Then they knew that there was a warm-hearted person in the temple who liked to wear plain clothes. No matter what happened to the neighbors, they would get help from that person. That person seemed to not know what trouble was. A small courtyard at the back of the mountain of the academy had also collapsed. Accompanied by the sound of the waterfall, the man sat in the pool and meditated for many days and nights with an ancient crown on his head. A fat man followed behind the sixth brother and sighed while carrying things such as earth, stones and wood, asking the man to repair the courtyard. Yi Su, the successor of the Jishou Abbey, walked calmly and silently among the passionate and secular people of Chang'an. Mr. Second of the Academy, Junemo, stood in front of the lonely and cold waterfall, accepting the baptism of the wet fog. His face became more and more indifferent, but his eyebrows became more and more straight. General Xiaohou, who returned from the frontier fortress, kept receiving rewards from the imperial court. He held banquets in the mansions of various princes and dukes. No one knew that he was still used to sitting in the back garden of his own general's mansion late at night, watching the yellow leaves fall on the bare branches and the falling snowflakes in silence. Ning Ke went back and forth between the back of the mountain of the academy and the Yanming Lake. He cultivated quietly and occasionally fought with Yi Hongyu. Most of the time, he was silent in the withering lotus field. Chang'an was very quiet, so it seemed very peaceful. Everyone in the city was silent, so it was peaceful. To most people, this silence and peace would at least last until the end of the winter of the 15th year of the Qianqi era. Because no one could break this peace no matter how they looked at it. The cold wind and snow came suddenly. Autumn had passed, and it was the day of the winter solstice. On this day, General Xiaohou returned to the palace to bid farewell. His Majesty the Tang Emperor would once again reward him for his meritorious service, and give him the honor of a family banquet. Then, all the civil and military officials of the imperial court would send him away from Chang'an. On this day, the small Taoist temple was finally rebuilt. Yi Su carefully combed his Taoist bun and stood behind the skinny Taoist, like a tacky receptionist in a village wedding. He thanked the neighbors who came to attend the ceremony, and then moved the chicken, duck, and wine in the hands of the neighbors to the back kitchen. On this day, third sister Yu Lian smiled and said to Tang Xiaotang by the low table by the east window of the old library in the back of the mountain of the academy. White mist rose in the iron forging room by the mirror lake, and seventh sister was embroidering in the pavilion in the middle of the lake. Everything was calm as usual, but the shadow of the tall hat that looked like a washing stick could no longer be seen in the green pond under the waterfall. Eldest brother was not in the back of the mountain either, but had gone to Chang'an as a guest. Eldest brother walked up the stone steps and looked at Yi Su with a smile. He said, "Congratulations." Yi Su looked at the renovated Taoist temple behind him and the roofs of the neighbors that he had personally repaired not far away. He showed a sincere smile and said, "Thank you, Mr. First." The people in the house by the Yanming Lake had also woken up. Ning Ke took a bath with the help of Sang Sang and changed into a brand new black academy uniform. He carefully tied up his hair and put on a flat hat. He suddenly looked much more energetic. Sang Sang also took a bath and then cut her hair short with a pair of scissors. She carefully combed a small braid and carefully powdered her hair in front of the bronze mirror. She even drew her eyebrows. Very beautiful. Ning Ke looked at the refreshing little girl in the mirror and said with a smile. Sang Sang stood up from the stool and turned around to tidy up his academy uniform. She took off the thread on his shoulder and said, "Today is our big day. We should be serious." Walking out of the bedroom, Ning Ke snapped his fingers and summoned the big black horse who had been eating wintersweet in the corner of the garden. He gently patted the horse's rump and said, "Go back to the academy by yourself." The big black horse slightly raised its head and felt a little confused. However, it was not a human after all. Even if it had doubts, it could not say it. It could only obey and ran out of the house and along the long street out of the city. Yi Hongyu was not the big black horse. She stood under the tree at the gate of the garden and looked at the master and servant who were wearing new clothes. Suddenly she pointed to the sky above the courtyard and said calmly, "It will snow heavily today. Do you still want to go out?" Dark clouds floated in the dark sky. The clouds were as heavy as mountains and it seemed that it would snow at any time. Ning Ke looked up at the sky and said, "Rain can keep people, but snow can't. After holding it in for a day, I just couldn't write it. Just when I was about to ask for leave, I thanked Lin Hai, Ting Tao, and Butterfly Blue for their encouragement. I finally succeeded in defeating myself. Thank them and thank you all." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 467. Yi Hongyu said, "You can't keep people in the snow, so you want to keep people here?" Ning Ke said, "I don't understand what you mean." Yi Hongyu asked, Why did you dismiss all the stewards and maids last night? Ning Ke said with a smile. Doesn't this prove that I didn't keep anyone here? Yi Hongyu said, you know what I mean. Ning Ke said, today is the winter solstice. The stewards and maids should spend more time with their families. Yi Hongyu said, then why do you want me to leave? Don't tell me that you haven't given up on assassinating Xia Ho. You are going to do it now. Ning Ke asked, are you worried about my life? Yi Hongyu shook her head. Ning Ke said with a smile, although it sounds sad, this is the real you. Since you are not worried about my life, why do you care what I do? Xia Ho is a visiting professor of Haotian Taoism. My brother came to Chang'an for this. He will not allow you to ruin it, and neither will I. So if you want to do it, I will keep you here. Yi Hongyu looked at him and said calmly. Her right hand was about to hold a virtual sword in the winter wind. Ning Ke looked at her right hand and said after a long silence, it seems that everyone in the world, including my sect, does not agree with me assassinating Xia Ho. He raised his head and looked into Yi Hongyu's eyes quietly. He said, you know what kind of person I am. I can't defeat Xia Ho, so I won't think about killing him. I want you to leave because I want to tell you that Yisu's Taoist temple is reopening today. Since it's the winter solstice, you should go there. Yi Hongyu said. You haven't said whether you are going to assassinate Xia Ho? Ning Ke said. I swear on the headmaster's character that I have never thought about assassinating Xia Ho. Yi Hongyu's expression did not change. She said, change your name. Ning Ke said, if I assassinate Xia Ho, then Sang Sang and I can never be together. Yi Hongyu was startled. She did not expect him to make such a promise. She frowned and asked, then why do you two care so much about today? Ning Ke said, we are going to the House of Red Sleeves to eat haggis soup. Yi Hongyu was silent. Her green robe fluttered slightly and she disappeared into the depths of the plum tree. The big black horse chewed on the fragrant plum blossoms and left Yinming Lake, running out of the city. The soldiers stationed at the south gate of Chang'an City had already been warned by the Fish Dragon Gang and knew the origin of the black horse. They did not stop it and just watched it disappear on the cold winter road outside the city. It didn't take long for the big black horse to run back to the academy. It stepped on the slope from the side door and entered the clouds. It appeared by the mirror lake on the cliff plateau of the back mountain. It kept panting and lowered its head to kiss itself on the surface of the lake. It drank the water greedily to moisten its throat and lungs that were about to burn. The big black horse did not know what Ning Ke was going to do, nor did he know why he felt so uneasy. He just vaguely felt that he should return to the academy earlier so that the people in the academy could guess what was going to happen at Yanming Lake. He thought that he was the messenger. Chun Pippi stood on the other side of the lake and looked at the big black horse on the other side. His round cheeks were filled with deep worry. Tang Xiaoting looked up at him and asked, will something happen? According to younger brother's character, he would not make any decision if he knew that he would lose. So nothing should happen. But why did the big black horse come back? Chun Pippi frowned slightly and said, now I realize that I don't seem to understand what he's thinking. I always thought that he was a cold, emotionless and realistic guy. So it's hard for me to imagine that he would do something brave and arrogant. Tang Xiaoting said, Ning Ke is a very shameless person. But my brother told me before I came to the academy that some people can be extremely shameless. In fact, it actually takes a lot of courage. Chun Pippi said after a moment of silence, I want to go to Chang'an City. Tang Xiaoting said, I will go with you. Chun Pippi shook his head and said, third sister will not agree. Teacher gave me a break in the morning when I was doing morning lessons. Tang Xiaoting looked at Chun Pippi and said seriously, Xia Ho is the biggest traitor of the Enlightenment doctrine in the past 1,000 years. My brother has always wanted to kill him and so do I. But it is a pity that I do not have the ability to do so. Since youngest uncle wants to kill him today, at least I have to watch from the side. The atmosphere in the palace was very calm. There was the sound of ceremonial music and warm fragrance. The palace maids and eunuchs walked in the hall with smiles on their faces. No one looked at the legendary cruel and cold-blooded General Xia Ho, and no one noticed the strange expression on His Majesty's face. His Majesty looked at Xia Ho below and said indifferently, since the matter has been resolved, don't make any more changes. I don't care about the relationship between Ning Ke and the Xianwei general, And I don't want to know about the recent murder cases in Chang'an City. After all, he is a student of the headmaster of academy. It will be difficult for you to meet him when you leave Chang'an City today. Since it is difficult to meet him, let's not make things difficult for each other. Xiahou left his seat and knelt down, calmly agreeing. His Majesty put his hands behind his back and silently left the side hall, ending the emperor's banquet for returning officials in advance. All the eunuchs and palace maids in the hall also left with him, leaving the side hall to the empress and General Xiahou, who had been quietly waiting by the side. According to the rules, it was very inappropriate for the empress to be alone with a general of the empire. However, this was His Majesty's order, and no one dared to object. The empress quietly looked at her brother below and sighed softly. She said, "Will he be all right?" Xiahou looked at her, and on his usual dark and indifferent face, there was a very rare warm and pampering smile. He said, "We are going back to our hometown. Nothing will happen. I feel relaxed like never before. Sister, you will be alone in Chang'an City from now on. You must be careful. If anything goes wrong, inform me as soon as possible." The empress smiled and said, "Judging from the movements in the academy, it should be peaceful. This was originally the agreement between Mr. First and me. I think the headmaster of the academy also has the same attitude. As for Ningke, we all know what kind of person he is. Of course it will be peaceful." Xiahou frowned slightly and forcibly suppressed the increasingly irritating cough in his chest. He did not want to let his sister worry about him after leaving Chang'an, and the empress silently looked at his face. Her gentle gaze seemed to be able to penetrate deep into his body. She looked at the injury in his lungs and faintly said, "In the wilderness, Tang caused you such a serious injury. I think he must not have had a good time. Why didn't you take the opportunity to kill him at that time?" Xiahou coughed softly and said, "He can hurt me and I can hurt him. It is all natural. However, if I want to kill him, I need to sacrifice more lives. Those cavalries in the wilderness are all loyal subordinates who have followed me for many years. Why should I let them exchange their lives?" Hearing this, the empress's expression became more and more gentle. She comforted him and said, "Brother, you have changed a lot. Not as cold, violent, and murderous as before?" Xiahou laughed at himself. He thought that when he and his sister left the wilderness and came to the Tang Empire, they did not have any background. His Majesty had not yet ascended the throne, and she was not the empress. What else could they do if they wanted to gain a foothold in such a big empire but to make all their enemies feel terrified? It was winter. Snow fell from the sky like powder, coating the red walls of the palace with a thin layer of powder. The square in front of the side hall was covered with snow, as if it would not stop. Xiahou silently looked at the cold snow outside the hall. He could not help but think of the snow-like ashes on his hands after he snatched the iron box from Ningke in the north of the Hulan Sea. Then, he seemed to hear some whimpering sounds in the deepest part of the wind and snow. It was not the whistling of the north wind, but the chirping of cicadas. He knew it was an auditory hallucination, but his face still became a little ugly. Decades ago, he left Tianqi Mountain and went south to the Tang Empire. He was full of pride and arrogance. However, when he decided to betray the Enlightenment doctrine and cook Murong Linshuang to death, his pride and anger had long disappeared. For so many years, he had only covered it with violence and cruelty, because from that day on, he was a traitor of the devil's doctrine. From that day on, there had been two extremely cold dark clouds in the depths of his heart that could not be driven away. One of the dark clouds was his teacher, Master Lotus. The other was the current suzerain of the devil's doctrine, 23-year cicada cultivation. Xiahou was very powerful and confident, but he was very clear that once the two dark clouds floated over, he would have no way out except death. When Ku Haoran destroyed the front gate of the devil's doctrine with a single sword, he did not see Master Lotus die with his own eyes. He could not believe that a person like his teacher would die so quietly. The current suzerain of the devil's doctrine cultivated 23-year cicada cultivation and hid in the world. He was known as the most mysterious person in the cultivation world. Although it was said that he had died long ago, Xiahou did not dare to believe it. Therefore he had been living in fear all these years. In the north of the Hulun Sea, Xiahou snatched the iron box from Ningkei's hands. In the box was not the Ming handscroll of the tomes of arcane, but the ashes of his teacher, Lotus. He was a little disappointed, then sad, and then relieved. It was probably at that moment that he really had the idea to retire and stop caring about the world. I don't know what adventure Ningkei had after entering the front gate. Xiahou looked at the dancing snowflakes outside the hall and said with a complicated expression, "Since the ashes of my teacher appeared in his hands, he might have inherited something. And suzerain, I don't know where he is hiding now. Although he certainly does not dare to stay in Chang, and there is nowhere in the world that he cannot go." The Empress was very clear about what her brother's biggest fear was. She walked to his side and softly comforted him. But Master Lotus is dead after all. The 23-year cicada cultivation that the suzerain cultivated is the world's most perverted and dangerous cultivation method. All these years, neither the Hautian Taoism nor the Academy could find any trace of him. I'm afraid that he is already dead. If he is still alive, why did he not come to you for so many years? I hope so, Xiahou said. Yi Su of the Hautian Taoism came to Chang'an, and the people of the Buddhism sect will also come. Now that I think about it, among the 3 sects in the world, only the devil's doctrine has withered like this. I can't help but feel a little sad. There are more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 468. Ningkei didn't lie to Yi Hongyu. He really took Sang Sang to the House of Red Sleeves, but he didn't hang around in Dewdrop's yard, nor did he peep at the new red cards. Instead, he went to the top floor and sat in Mistress Jian's room. He rolled up his sleeves and started to attack the pot of mutton giblets soup. The mutton giblets soup was made with excellent utensils, and there were more than 10 plates of side dishes and vegetables. The steam was steaming and green. It was a wonderful atmosphere for the winter solstice. Ningkei picked up a chopstick from the bowl, dipped it in the minced garlic, and put it into his mouth to chew. He put the 9 River double-distilled liquor into his mouth. It was so spicy that he frowned, as if he had encountered a very difficult problem. Mistress Jian took the towel from Xiao Chao and wiped the sweat on her forehead. She looked at him and said, "I've brought the Empress's words. As long as you can spend today peacefully, the Empress is willing to pay any price you need. Of course, she will apologize to you again on behalf of Xiahou." Ningkei pointed at his wrinkled brows because of the spiciness of the liquor and said, "The problem is that there is a knot between my brows that can't be stretched. I can't think it through. That's because of the spiciness of the liquor. You can't drink as well as Sang Sang, so don't drink hard liquor." Mistress Jian's words seemed to have a hidden meaning. After saying this, she was silent for a long time, and then cautiously and gently persuaded him again. Great wisdom is to be able to endure and be calm. Ningkei nodded and said, "I understand." Mistress Jian comforted him with a smile, and then sighed and said, "Before you came, I was really worried that you would mess around like that guy in the past." According to the senior brothers in the academy, Mistress Jian should be youngest uncle's sister-in-law. In this case, she was the only one in the world who dared to call youngest uncle that guy. "I'm not as capable as youngest uncle," he said with a smile, and then his smile gradually disappeared. He said, "If I were as capable as youngest uncle, I wouldn't have to endure anymore. Since I've entered the human realm, I must kill well. I can't let Master's prestige or youngest uncle's name be tarnished." Mistress Jian frowned and said, "Entering the human realm is not to kill, but to understand." Ningkei said, "Isn't killing also a kind of enlightenment?" After saying this, Ningkei became drunk. It was unknown whether it was the double-distilled liquor from Hebei County that made him drunk, or he found that he was unable to tear apart the dense net of the powerhouses in Chang, and so he had to get drunk. Perhaps he just wanted to use the drunkenness to hide some of his thoughts. As usual, after getting drunk at the House of Red Sleeves, he slept in Dewdrop's courtyard. The bed was still warm and fragrant. Fortunately, there was not much of the smell of Yen Sei's stinky feet. Sang Sang sat at the head of the bed, took a wet towel and put it on his forehead. She knew very well that Ningkei was pretending to be drunk, so she declined Dewdrop's suggestion to make soup to sober him up. Ning Ke did not dream in his tipsy state. He did not see the darkness in the distance, did not see the three extremely cold black smoke, and did not see the infinite light in the sky above his head. He just sank his consciousness into his sense of perception, all the way to the deepest bottom of the sea, and picked up those fragments of consciousness to feel them silently. These fragments of consciousness were obtained after the bloody battle with Lotus at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine last year. Before Master Lotus died, he forcibly transferred these fragments of consciousness into his sense of perception. Since then, he had been carefully feeling them, but he did not gain any concrete results. However, he knew that these fragments of consciousness were very important, at least to him, because in the north of the Hulun Sea, it was with these fragments of consciousness that he instinctively made a very effective dodge when facing Xiaoho's mighty iron fist. He seemed to be able to guess Xiaoho's thoughts during the battle. Drunk and lying on the warm bed, Ning Ke's right hand unconsciously fell on his waist. There were a few hard things in his belt, the waist token of the academy, and some other waist tokens. These waist tokens in his belt seemed to give him some spiritual comfort, making his consciousness and his sense of perception become more and more peaceful and clear. At this time, he still did not have enough state to fully understand the deep meaning of the fragments of consciousness left by Master Lotus. However, he already understood how important these fragments of consciousness would be in the battle with Xiaoho. At the Yinming Lake, Yi Hongyu once said that grand cultivators who entered the knowing destiny state could sense the slightest changes in the qi of heaven and earth. All the means of their opponents could not surpass their experience and perception. This kind of battle consciousness was the most terrifying part of the knowing destiny state powerhouses. Ning Ke was now in the upper state of see-through. If he wanted to fight with a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state, the huge gap in battle consciousness alone would make him feel hopeless. However, there were many fragments of consciousness left by Lotus deep in his sense of perception. As the great divine priest of West Hill, the bigwig who was the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect, he had already reached the peak of the knowing destiny state when he was alive. If not for some very mysterious reasons, he would have already broken through the 5 states and become a divine transcendence. What kind of state did the fragments of consciousness left by Master Lotus reach? Ning Ke did not know. This kind of thing could only be found out in the battle. After waking up, Ning Ke felt refreshed and sober. After confirming that his body and spirit were in the best state of his life, he left the house of red sleeves with Sang Sang. The wind and snow in Chang and were heavier than in the morning. Like goose feathers, they danced restlessly and then fell, dyeing the whole city white. Holding the dirty big black umbrella, Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked in this plain world of ice and snow, like a dazzling drop of ink. The common people in the city were celebrating the festival. Accompanied by the mellow smell of mutton giblets soup, the thick snow on the eaves seemed to have become freshly cooked mutton slices. The nobles also celebrated the festival. However, there was no noise coming from the quiet and solemn mansions in the North City. Ning Ke knew why. The officials in the mansions were all going to the imperial city to see Xiaoho off. They might even send the general out of Chang and... He held the handle of the big black umbrella in his right hand and held Song Song's hand in his left. They walked in the wind and snow, in the beautiful atmosphere of the marketplace and the noble atmosphere of the North City. He was silent. In the summer of the 15th year of Tianqi era, Chang'an had been peaceful for a long time. The people in the city, including the senior brothers and sisters in the academy, probably thought that the peace would continue. They all thought that Ning Ke had given up the idea. No matter how they looked at it, they could not find a suitable way for him. It was impossible for Ning Ke to give up. Just like what he had said to Sang Sang in the summer, if he did not kill Xiaoho, Xiaoho would really be old. Revenge itself was not important. What was important was that he had to give an account of his life. Without this account, his life would not be complete. He might die because Xiaoho was indeed very powerful. In the wilderness, even eldest brother said that he was not sure that he could kill Xiaoho. But he did not think that he would die. Except for the headmaster of academy, no one in the world knew better than him that he was very powerful now. Life was like a puzzle. Ning Ke had solved many puzzles in the past 15 years. The purpose of solving the puzzles was today's battle, and he firmly believed that he would win. The imperial city was shrouded in heavy snow. The red palace wall was particularly eye-catching in the snow. The atmosphere in front of the imperial city was different from the cold wind and snow. Dozens of luxurious horse carriages were waiting outside the square in front of the palace. A few hundred feet ahead of the jade fence of the moat was the palace gate. There were many people there. Prince Li Peiyan came. The Defender General of the state Su Shi, the Grand Secretary and the ministers came. Except for the Prime Minister who was recuperating from illness, all the bigwigs of the imperial court and the military of the Tang Empire appeared in front of the imperial city. They were here to see off General Xia Ho. Looking at the tall figure slowly walking out of the gate of the imperial city, the bigwigs' faces showed complicated emotions. Some smiled comfortingly, some sighed, and some were sad. This was the first general of the Tang Empire to retire in the Tianqi era. Looking back more than 100 years, he was probably the only general who had given up his military power without any reason. Xia Ho slowly walked out of the gate. Looking at the bigwigs and colleagues who had been with him for decades, his solemn face was also very complicated. Leaving the imperial palace and going to his hometown, he was no longer a general, but a farmer retiring in old age. He was indeed a little reluctant. He was reluctant to give up the power to hold a killing knife in his hand. He was reluctant to give up the iron cavalry in the military camp. He was reluctant to give up the days of watching swords by lantern at night. What was most reluctant was that the law of the Tang Empire could not shake him, the enemy's army could not defeat him, and even the West Hill Divine Palace quietly indulged him. But he was forced to leave this prosperous stage. However, since the founding of the Tang Empire, there were not many ministers who could receive such an honor. Not to mention that a traitor of the devil's doctrine could become a visiting professor of Haotian Taoism, a general of the Tang Empire, expand the territory, kill countless people, and retire peacefully. This was a very perfect life. Xia Ho was very satisfied. In the quiet city gate, he walked out of the palace and walked toward the bigwigs who were looking at him with a smile. With every step he took, his whole body relaxed a little. Walking out of the city gate, his military boots squeaked on the snow. Xia Ho frowned slightly. He did not return the salute to the prince who personally welcomed him, but looked to the south of the imperial palace. The prince's expression changed slightly and he turned to look. The people at the palace gate all found something strange and turned to look in that direction in confusion. Old General Su Shi suddenly coughed painfully. In the sky full of snow, his white eyebrows looked like two pieces of sticky snow that refused to fall. He was a little angry but also a little helpless. In the sky full of snow, a big black umbrella slowly walked over. There were two people under the black umbrella. The black umbrella was very big and its surface was very thick. No matter how strong the wind and snow were, it could not invade it. The heavy snow fell on the oily surface of the black umbrella, but did not stick to it. Instead, it seemed to be a little afraid and slid to the sides. Looking at the big black umbrella slowly in the snow, Xia Ho did not know why he felt completely relaxed. It was not until this moment that he realized that he had actually been waiting for the arrival of this person. The traditional version has been published. Today I received the sample book. I like it very much. Thank you to the students of the publishing house. My friends from Taiwan, I wonder if you have seen it. In addition, about understanding this song, the singer of China voice did not sing my favorite song. I still like the version with Yang Zhongwei's broken voice the most. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 469. In the wind and snow, the big black umbrella slowly came to the palace gate and stopped in front of the Tang civil and military officials. Then it closed, revealing Ning Ke and Sang Sang under the umbrella. It was dead silent in front of the imperial city. Only the sound of the cold wind blowing the snow, the sound of the snow falling on the ice of the moat, and people's own breathing could be heard. These bigwigs looked at Ning Ke and frowned at the same time. They seemed to be very confused about what Mr. 13 of the academy wanted to do on the day General Xia Ho left the capital. Their complicated expressions and confusion were actually cover-ups. They all knew about the rumor and knew that the military had investigated Ning Kei's connection with the murder cases, so they could guess his intention. But from summer to autumn and then to winter Chang and had been peaceful for a long time. When the whole world thought that Ning Kei had given up, he really appeared. In the silence, everyone looked at Ning Kei with vigilance and uneasiness. Zhang Jing, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library, looked at Sang Sang beside Ning Kei with a worried expression. Prince Li Peiyan slowly took a step forward and looked at Ning Kei with hidden anger. He said, "What do you want to do?" General Su Shi looked at Ning Kei expressionlessly and said, "If you want to assassinate a general of the Tang Empire in front of all the civil and military officials, I will admire your courage and stupidity." The snow continued to fall toward the imperial city. Ning Kei brushed off the thick snow on his shoulder and said, "Even if I have the courage, I will not be so stupid. But since I am here, I have to do something." Su Shi said lightly and sarcastically, "What can you do in front of the law of the Tang Empire?" The change in front of the imperial city gate had alarmed the Yulin royal guards and the imperial bodyguards. The chief eunuch who had sent General Xiahou to the exit had already run into the palace as fast as he could to inform His Majesty of the news. Many imperial court subordinates came from the square and walked behind the adults. They opened umbrellas to shelter them from the wind and snow. In front of the red wall, flowers of different colors suddenly bloomed. Ning Kei's big black umbrella had been put away and was held in Song Song's hand. The master and handmaiden stood in the wind and snow calmly, looking at the more and more umbrellas in front of them. The shadows of the umbrellas shrouded the faces of the adults. No one could see the emotions on their faces, nor could they see the thoughts in their eyes. Ning Kei looked at Su Shi and said calmly, "The law of the Tang Empire comes first. This is the iron rule of the academy. As a disciple of the academy and a student of the headmaster of the academy, I will certainly abide by it. Therefore, I think it is extremely absurd that the military is investigating whether I am a suspect in those murders." Su Shi frowned slightly and said, "There are so many old officials of the imperial court standing in the wind and snow talking to you. Do you think they want to hear you clear your name?" Ning Kei did not pay any more attention to the military leader of the Tang Empire. He turned to look at Xiahou and said, "Many people are guessing what I will do. I believe you have been guessing too. In fact, from the day I decided to kill you, I have been guessing what I will do." Indeed, the most important bigwigs of the Tang Empire in front of the imperial city had been guessing what Ning Kei would do. Even when they saw him at this time, they did not know what he was going to do. Ning Kei looked at Xiahou and said seriously, "It was not until autumn that I finally understood what I should do. I want to challenge you." His voice was not very clear in the howling wind and snow. However, the content of this sentence was clearly passed through the wind and snow and into everyone's ears. The voice gradually disappeared from the vermilion palace wall. A thin piece of paper floated out of Ning Kei's sleeve. Ignoring the heavy snow falling from the sky, it slowly and steadily floated in front of Xiahou. No matter how strong the wind in front of the imperial city and how heavy the snow was, it seemed to have no effect on this thin piece of paper. Xiahou silently looked at Ning Kei, who was not far away. He looked at the white paper that seemed to be pulled by countless strings and slowly floated towards him. There was no emotion on his face that was covered by the shadow of the umbrella. He raised his right hand and grabbed the thin piece of paper that floated in front of him. It was a letter of challenge. From the moment Ning Kei said that he wanted to challenge Xiahou, it became even quieter in front of the imperial city. Even the sound of the wind and snow seemed to have disappeared. His words echoed in everyone's ears, and everyone's eyes were fixed on the thin piece of paper that was moving forward slowly and firmly in the wind and snow. Ning Kei wanted to challenge General Xiahou head-on? Everyone thought that they had misheard because in their opinion, this was something that would never happen. People in the imperial court certainly knew that Ning Kei was the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, and had learned talisman Taoism from Master Yen Sei. In less than 2 years of cultivation, he had already become a powerhouse in the see-through state. The upper see-through state was almost like an immortal in the eyes of mortals. However, decades ago, General Xiahou was already a powerhouse in the peak state of martial arts, and one of the most powerful men in the world. What qualifications did Ning Kei have to challenge Xiahou? This was like a flower challenging a forest, a mantis challenging a horse carriage, an egg challenging a stone mountain, and a beggar challenging the great emperor. General Sushur silently thought that Ninkei was probably really driven crazy. If he was not crazy, how could he do such a crazy thing? Prince Li Peiyan's face was a little stiff, but in an instant it became gentle again. He felt that he had probably guessed Ninkei's thoughts. Ninkei's father's death was absolutely irreconcilable, and he could not go against the will of the academy and the law of the Tang Empire. So he came to challenge Xiahou. Even if he lost, it would be considered an explanation. After the shock, people in front of the imperial city came up with two different ideas. If Ninkei was not crazy, then he was only challenging General Xiahou for spiritual comfort. Looking at Ninkei, who was bathed in the wind and snow, and his calm expression, bigwigs did not think that he was really crazy. Then they thought that there should not be anything too bloody next. Ninkei could not defeat General Xiahou. Even if General Xiahou won this duel, he could not really kill Mr. 13 for the sake of the academy and the headmaster of the academy. Yes, things should be like this. However, what happened next directly destroyed all their imaginations and expectations. Ninkei took a small knife from Song Song's hand and used the blade to stab his left palm. Then he began to move. The blade moved very slowly on his palm, and the sharp blade slowly cut a long wound. Blood began to ooze out, and the slightly white skin was instantly dyed red. There were exclamations and gasps in front of the imperial city. People looked at the blade cutting slowly on his palm, as if the sharp tip of the knife was cutting their own bodies, and it was extremely painful. Ninkei was not affected by these exclamations. His expression was calm and very focused, as if he was not cutting his palm, but carving a flower in his palm. Ninkei, you are crazy. Zhang Jing, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library, could no longer keep silent. He anxiously walked out of the crowd and looked at Sang Sang, yelling, "Hurry up and stop him!" Sang Sang lowered her head and looked at her boots stepping in the snow. The prince's face suddenly became abnormally pale. General Sushur's fluttering snow-white eyebrows suddenly dropped, as if he could not bear a heavy burden. Everyone in front of the imperial city looked extremely shocked. Only Xiahou remained expressionless and silent. He calmly and attentively watched Ninkei cut his palm, and the two iron eyebrows in the shadow slowly raised. What shocked and even astonished the crowd was not the pain that Ninkei might bring by cutting his palm, but the meaning of his action. The Tangs worshipped martial arts, and their temperament was simple and direct. If they did not agree with each other, they would often punch each other. Duels became the most common scene in Chang'an. On that spring night 2 years ago, Ninkei and Sang Sang returned from the city of Wei to Chang'an and saw a duel on the street that night. At that time, he explained to the little handmaiden beside him that the rule of duels in Chang'an was that cutting one's sleeve represented a challenge, and that it was called a live game. As long as there was a winner, it would be fine. However, if the challenger cut his left palm, it meant that the duel was a dead game. At this time in the snow of the imperial city, Ninkei slowly cut his left palm, which meant that the challenge he issued to Xiahou today was not a spiritual comfort as people had previously thought, but a dead game of life and death. Although the civil and military officials present were of high status and could not be challenged, they all lived in Chang'an and knew this extremely well-known rule. So they were shocked and even pale. In their view, General Xiahou would definitely win today's challenge. However, if it was a dead game and Ninkei died with his identity as a core disciple of the headmaster of academy, it would still have a terrible impact on the imperial court of the Tang Empire. Li Peiyan stared at Ninkei with a pale face and said, "Are you going to use your life in exchange for the headmaster's anger? Is it worth it? And what kind of person is the headmaster? How can he be used by you?" The blade had already cut the base of his palm. Ninkei stopped moving and raised his head. His expression was still so calm, as if the pain in his palm did not affect him at all. He looked at the prince and said, "What does this have to do with your highness? Are you afraid that I will challenge you next?" Sushur looked at him and said expressionlessly, "A duel of life and death requires the approval of the government. I can tell you that no one in the imperial court of the Tang Empire dares to approve this duel. When Daosher Monk came to challenge me, it was approved by the military ministry. When Lu Yiqing challenged me, it was also approved by the military ministry. Today I challenge General Xiahou. Does the military ministry not approve? Ning Ke looked at him and asked seriously. Does the Tang Empire's military have any shame? Su Shi frowned slightly and did not speak. Ning Ke looked at everyone in front of the imperial city and said, "You all say that the law of the Tang Empire is the first. Fine, I will challenge according to the law of the Tang Empire. I want to know who can stop me?" Then he looked at Xiahou and said, "Unless you don't accept it." Xiahou slowly stroked the thin letter of challenge between his fingers. His expression was a little strange. He looked at him and said, "Your choice is indeed beyond my expectation." Ning Ke said, "I have never taken the ordinary path." Xiahou lightly flicked the thin paper in his hand and said, "When I saw this paper moving slowly in the wind and snow, I knew that your psyche power is very sensitive. It is a pity that your snow mountain and ocean of qi are blocked, and your control of the qi of heaven and earth is extremely bad, even worse than the see-through state that you should have. You are so bad, and yet you want to challenge me. I can only say that you have embarked on a dead end." Ning Ke looked at him and said, "I have no other path to take, so I have to take this path. As for whether it is a dead end, I will know when I reach the end." Xiahou said, "For you, challenging me head-on is the worst choice." Ning Ke said, "Since it is the only choice, then it is the best choice." Ning Ke's choice was decided when I started the book. It was decided on the night he and Sang Sang entered Chang, and it was really the only choice and the best choice. But he is not Su Lu. He doesn't know the concept of bravery. It's just a decision made after careful consideration and helplessness. I am here to report that there is still some time before I kill Xiahou. This is just a bone and I have other things to write. It is meat very important and there is more today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 470. Xiahou smiled and slowly walked out of the umbrella held by his subordinate. He walked into the wind and snow and his smile suddenly disappeared. He looked at Ning Ke coldly and said, "Is this the Academy's choice?" Ning Ke also smiled and said, "You don't have to be afraid. This is my own choice. It has nothing to do with the Academy." Xiahou said indifferently, "If you want to die, then you will die." Ning Ke said, "I don't want to die. I only want you to die." Xiahou looked at him and said after a long silence, "You are a madman." Ning Ke replied, 15 years ago, I escaped from Chang and I used the determination and willpower to die to survive. It was just to go crazy. Is it not worth it?" Xiahou was silent for a moment and said, "It is indeed worth it." The idea of returning good for evil had never been popular in the Tang Empire. People living in this land were used to being simple and direct. If you want to beat me, I will beat you. If you want to kill me, I will kill you. If you kill my father, I will kill your father and you. Therefore, everyone felt that it was reasonable for Ning Ke to invite Xiahou to a duel to the death. Through the academy, the imperial court had promised to cut off the past and let Xiahou retire. It was because they did not want the complications of the past to affect the future of the empire. They did not want the West Hill Divine Palace to meddle in Chang, and if Ning Ke wanted to use tricks to deal with Xiahou, it would affect the process of metabolism. But today he chose the simplest or perhaps the stupidest method. It would not leave any repercussions, because if the environment was fair, then the duel must be fair. Fairness did not mean there were no problems. Everyone thought that Ning Ke was courting death by challenging General Xiahou. No one wanted to see Ning Ke die because he was a disciple of the headmaster of the academy. But they could not stop this duel now and could only hope that Xiahou would not accept Ning Ke's invitation. As a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, it was indeed very humiliating to refuse the challenge of a see-through realm. Therefore, the prince looked at Xiahou with a faint pleading expression. Xiahou didn't seem to notice the prince's gaze. He squinted and said, "Since you want to die in my hands." Right at this moment, the sound of hurried footsteps could be heard outside the palace gate. A few high-ranking eunuchs were desperately running towards the door. Their official robes were in a mess and they looked extremely battered and exhausted. In the cold wind and snow, they were so hot that their foreheads were covered with sweat. It seemed like they had run all the way out of the palace. Eunuch Lin, who was running at the very front of the group of eunuchs, heard Xiaoho's voice from a distance. A terrified expression appeared on his face. Like a goose whose throat had been grabbed, he shrieked in panic. His Majesty has decreed that no one is to move. When the important figures of the outer palace heard this shout, their expressions suddenly relaxed. They thought that in this world, perhaps only the emperor could stop this challenge. However, Xiaoho didn't seem to hear the shrill voice coming from the palace gate behind him, nor did he hear the emperor's decree. With an indifferent expression, he continued, "Then I will fulfill your wish." After saying this, he took a knife from a bodyguard behind him. With a swish, he cut a large wound on his left palm. Compared to Ning Kei's slow cutting of his palm earlier, this movement was exceptionally simple and powerful. Xiaoho's face was expressionless. He slowly clenched his left hand into a fist. Thick blood flowed from the webbing between his thumb and index finger. Eunuch Lin had never run so fast or so hard in his life. When he ran out of the palace gate, panting, he saw Xiaoho's bleeding palm. His face immediately turned extremely pale. His legs gave way and he sat down in the snow. Prince Li Peiyan's face was as pale as snow. Su Shi's silver eyebrows were as calm as the snow on the willows by the lake. He looked at Xiaoho and said expressionlessly, "Withdraw it." Xiaoho shook his head and said indifferently, "He can withdraw it, but I can't. Because I have my pride." Hearing this, Ning Kei began to clap. His left palm was still bleeding. As he clapped, the blood scattered and splashed in all directions, landing on his black academy uniform and on the white snow on the ground. The scene looked extremely bloody. The clapping was also very bloody. The blood splashed, giving off a feeling that it was about to coagulate. Ning Kei said, "I am not disappointed. You are indeed still that arrogant and ruthless general. You are indeed arrogant to the point of stupidity. I hope that you will continue to be so arrogant." Xiaoho ignored his mockery and said expressionlessly, "When?" The date column on the thin challenge document was blank. Ning Kei said, "As long as it is before you leave Chang," and Xiaoho said, "I am leaving today." Ning Kei said, "Then today it is." Xiaoho said, "Very good. I will set off after killing you. It shouldn't take too long." Ning Kei said, "Perhaps you won't set off again." Xiaoho was still expressionless. He said indifferently, "I will decide the time and you decide the location. I have prepared the location for a long time." Ning Kei said, "I have bought many houses by the Yanming Lake. I don't need to worry about hurting innocent people when I fight there. Besides, I have made some preparations there. After all, I am a talisman master and know a little about tactical arrays. My state is not as good as yours, so I want to take advantage of you in this aspect." When the two were talking, no one interrupted. They listened in shock and helplessness. Only when they heard the location Ning Kei had chosen did their expressions change. In fact, many bigwigs in Chang and knew that Ning Kei had bought houses by the Yanming Lake. Bigwigs in the military like General Su Shi knew that Ning Kei had done something there. Therefore, they were not surprised that Ning Kei had chosen this place. They were only surprised that he would tell Xiaoho about it. Ning Kei looked at Xiaoho and said, "Do you mind?" Xiaoho said, "Since you are arrogant, even if you are stupid, you still have to be arrogant." Ning Kei shook his head and said, "Arrogance kills." Xiaoho said, "If an eagle is not arrogant in front of an ant, it will be punished by God." "Enough. You are two crazy people." Prince Li Peiyan's face was pale and his eyes were full of fire. He looked at Xiaoho and scolded, "Have you ever thought about how you will explain it to the headmaster if you kill this person? How will the imperial court explain it to the headmaster? This king will use this crown to exchange for 2 hours of time." After saying this, he resolutely took off the crown on his head and put it on the snow between Ning Kei and Xiaoho. He looked back at the civil and military officials and said coldly, "What are you waiting for? Get to work." The officials of the imperial court came to their senses. With the help of their subordinates, they scattered as fast as they could to find a way to stop this duel. Grand Secretary Zheng Jing wanted to go to Ning Kei and persuade him, But when he saw his bleeding palms, he could only sigh and retreat to the back. Su Shi's eyelids drooped slightly. He seemed to be looking at Xiahou and Ningke, and also at the wind and snow in the sky. He said indifferently, "It will happen in more than 10 years. Why do you care about waiting for 2 hours?" After saying this, he turned and left the palace gate. No one knew where he was going. In front of the gate of the Snow Palace, the officials of the imperial court left one by one. Only Grand Secretary Zheng Jing and a few other onlookers were left. In the silence, Xiahou suddenly said, "Bring the flag." On the other side of the Jade Bridge in the distance, there was a guard of honor for the general's glorious return. Hundreds of people had been waiting for a long time. Hearing these 2 words, a bodyguard sprinted over and took a large flag from the guard of honor. Then, he stood solemnly behind General Xiaohu's army. The cold wind howled with the snow and immediately fluttered the large flag. It was the flag of the Tang Empire. It was blood red, as if it was dyed with the blood of tens of thousands of enemies. It whistled and danced in the wind and snow. In front of the palace gate, it suddenly became very solemn. Ningke looked at the blood flag behind Xiahou and his face that was reflected by the flag. He said, "It seems that you are really afraid to use the flag to help you." Xiahou looked at the blood indifferently, with no other eyes. Ningke smiled and said, "Umbrella." With a bang, Sang Sang opened the big black umbrella again to block the falling snow above her head. In the wind and snow, a blood flag and a black umbrella faced each other. Mr. 13 of the Academy, Ningke, had issued a life and death challenge to General Xiahou. This news spread to every mansion in Chang, and in the shortest time possible. No one thought that Ningke could win, so no one was willing to watch General Xiahou kill him. Because no one knew what the headmaster of the academy would do because of Ningke's death. The headmaster of the academy had not spoken for many years, and had even been forgotten by the common people. But for the bigwigs in the imperial court, it did not mean that the headmaster of the academy's voice had lost its power. It was because every word he said was like a thunder above the clouds to the Tang Empire. This was a fair challenge initiated by Ning Quebec. Maybe even if Ningke died, the headmaster of the academy would still abide by the law of the Tang Empire and remain silent. But no one dared to take such a risk even if it was a small one. If the headmaster of the academy was angry after Ningke's death, the entire Chang and would probably be destroyed. When the nation master Li Qingshan appeared in front of the cloud gate array, he had been thinking about these things. So when he heard the reply from Mr. First of the academy, he was stunned for a long time. This is youngest brother's personal matter. The academy will not stop him according to the rules of the academy. Li Qingshan frowned and said, "But Ningke is seeking his own death." Eldest brother said gently, "Since he is seeking his own death, who can stop him?" Li Qingshan could not suppress the shock in his heart and said, "If Mr. 13 really dies in the hands of General Xiahou, what will the academy do?" Eldest brother smiled and said, "We will miss him." There was the Yulin Royal Guards in Chang'an. This powerful army was responsible for guarding the imperial city and possessed unimaginable power. It had powerful cultivators from the Imperial Center Administration and the Southern Gate Temple. Most importantly, it had strong willpower and determination. According to the law of the Tang Empire, the Yulin Royal Guards only listened to the orders of 2 people, the Tang Emperor and General Su Shi. Against the cold wind and snow, the Yulin Royal Guards began to form up and prepare to leave the camp. However, they had to stop in front of the Jade Bridge outside the camp because there was a person on the bridge. That person was wearing a tall hat and a robe. He sat cross-legged in the snow on the bridge with his head slightly lowered. Su Shi looked at the person on the bridge and could no longer suppress the anger in his heart. His voice burst out like thunder at the bridge and shook the flying snow. "Junemo, those who stand in our way will die." The person on the bridge was naturally second brother of the academy, Junemo, "Those who stand in our way will die?" This has never been mentioned in the law of the Tang Empire. Second brother raised his head and looked at the military leader of the Tang Empire under the bridge. He said calmly, if you want me to die, you must die first." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 471. Except for Ji Haoran and Ningke, the two generations of people who had entered the human realm, the back of the mountain of the academy had never entered the human realm. The soldiers of the Yulin royal guards on the other side of the bridge did not know who the man sitting cross-legged in the snow was. Hearing that this person actually dared to be so disrespectful to General Su Shi and be so arrogant, the imperial guards were instantly enraged to the extreme. Their beards and hair stood on end as if they wanted to pierce through the armor on their bodies, and they drew their swords and spears with the intention of charging onto the snow bridge and beheading that bastard on the spot. Su Shi raised his right arm expressionlessly, and the commotion and killing intent behind him immediately subsided. He looked at the man sitting cross-legged in the snow and became serious. He said, "Is the academy really going to go back on its words?" Second brother looked at him under the bridge and said, "The academy does not object to Xiaoho's retirement, nor does it object to youngest brother's challenge, because there is no way to object." Su Shi frowned and said, "You know I'm going to object to this." Second brother said, "I object to your objection." Su Shi looked at the man on the bridge. After a long silence, he asked in a hoarse voice, "Is this the headmaster's idea?" Second brother said, "No, it's my idea." Su Shi squinted and said, "That's why you are standing on the bridge." Second brother sat cross-legged in the snow, tall and straight. His robe did not tremble in the wind. He looked like a pine tree in the snow peak, very much like the great figure of the academy. He looked at Su Shi and the cavalry of the Yulin royal guards under the bridge and said expressionlessly, "I respect youngest brother, so I will not interfere. But I want him to be fair." In the imperial study of the palace, angry curses, fierce arguments, idiots, and all kinds of filthy words kept ringing. They were like snowflakes dancing in the sky, spreading everywhere. Nation Master Li Qingshan left the academy and entered Chang, and as fast as he could, he came to the newly renovated small Taoist temple. Because of the heavy snow, the neighborhood celebration had ended hastily. Yi Su smiled after hearing what happened in the imperial city, and disappeared in the wind and snow. Many horse carriages came from the streets outside the imperial city. All the forces who had received the news had sent people to inquire about it, including the envoys of various countries and the representatives of the West Hill Divine Palace. In a pavilion far away from the moat, Yi Hongyu, who was dressed in a green Taoist robe, looked in the direction of the palace gate. She looked at the blood flag and the dazzling big black umbrella that were fluttering in the wind and snow. She remained silent. Chun Pippi brought Tang Xiaotang from the other end of the snowy street. Because of Tang Xiaotang's status, he did not let her follow him to the imperial palace. He turned around and knocked on the tightly closed door of a shop on the South Street. He borrowed a chair from that shop and then moved his round body from the snowy street to the foot of the imperial city. He looked at Ningke and said, "Before preparing to fight, you have to conserve your strength." Ningke replied, "Thank you, senior brother." A personal guard had already brought a table and a chair for Xiaoho, and even a cup of hot tea. In front of the blood flag amidst the wind and snow, he held the teacup and casually drank, his expression naturally calm. Seeing Chun Pippi, Xiaoho frowned slightly, but did not pay much attention to him. Ningke sat on the chair, and Sang Sang held the big black umbrella behind the chair. Chun Pippi wanted to bandage his bleeding left palm, but Ningke shook his head and refused. In front of the palace gate, the blood flag and the black umbrella were in the wind and snow. The general was drinking hot tea, and Ningke was resting. This scene was very strange, even a little absurd, but also very scary. Many horse carriages were hidden in the streets in front of the imperial city, and many people had not arrived at the scene. They were waiting for the final result in their respective mansions. Mr. Second's appearance on the snow bridge is equivalent to the Academy's attitude. The Academy agrees that Ningke will challenge Xiaoho, so the Tang military cannot stop this. The third minister of offerings from Qinghe County withdrew his gaze from the falling snow in front of the balcony of the princess mansion. He looked at the two noble royal siblings and said with a smile, "Congratulations, Your Highness." Li Yu's expression was very calm, but there was a hidden worry in the depths of her eyes. Xiaoho was the empress's most powerful helper. It was a good thing for her and Li Huiyuan that he retired. It was even better for Ningke to challenge Xiaoho. No matter who won or lost, even if the Academy kept silent about it, they would still hate the Empress's side. However, she could not be happy because she, like everyone else in the world, believed that Ning Ke could not defeat Xiao Ho. In other words, Ning Ke would definitely die today. She looked at He Mingqi, who had been sitting silently on the other side, and slightly frowned. She asked, "What did Mr. Yisu say about the Nation Master going to the small Taoist temple?" He Mingqi shook his head and said, "Even if the West Hill Divine Palace wants to stop this in Chang, and it is impossible, because the Academy has already agreed." The third Minister of Offerings said lightly, "If your Highness is still worried, I may have some means to make the West Hill Divine Palace and the Academy hate each other because of this matter." Hearing this, Li Yu's expression gradually turned cold. She slightly narrowed her eyes and warned, "Don't try to use any means to provoke the Academy's anger. Neither you nor I can bear it." The third Minister of Offerings was usually respected in Qinghe Prefecture, like an ancestor. In front of the princess of the Tang Empire, he could consider himself inferior. However, after hearing this, he still felt a little embarrassed. "Your Highness is right. Then I will go and have a look," he said expressionlessly. He gently flicked his sleeves and walked out of the balcony. Facing the wind and snow, he left the princess mansion and walked towards the Yinming Lake. The snow kept falling, and it was getting heavier and heavier, falling on Chang, and no matter how light the snow was, it would eventually fall on the ground, or be swept into the gutters, or accumulate until the next year. When the flowers bloomed in spring, it would be melted by the sun, mixed with dust and withered leaves, and disappear without a trace. This was the truth of heaven and earth. Just as what should be done had to be done, people who should come would come. Many people came to Chang, and accompanied by the wind and snow, including a monk. The monk was wearing a worn-out bamboo hat and a tattered kapok kasaya. His face, which was exposed under the shadow of the bamboo hat, was ordinary, but it had a natural sense of determination. The monk entered the city through the west gate and stood on the snowy long street. It seemed that he did not know where to go. He turned to a porridge shop, took off his bamboo hat and began to ask for directions. He took off his bamboo hat, revealing a head full of sharp green and black hair. He looked as determined as the monk. However, when he asked for directions, the smile on his face was so kind and gentle. It was not accurate to use the word, asking for directions. The monk kept his mouth tightly shut, and when he occasionally grinned, only half of his tongue was left. It turned out that he was a mute who could not speak. For Ning Ke and Xiao Ho, who were sitting in the wind and snow, the 2 hours were very long. No matter how cold the wind and snow was, their bodies had already warmed up. For His Majesty in the palace and Su Shi on the other side of the snow bridge, the 2 hours were very short. Because the Academy's attitude made them feel helpless and they had no time to do more. Just when the 2 hours were about to end, the imperial court finally found a way. The palace gate suddenly opened. Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, and Zhang Jing, the grand secretary of the imperial library, hurried to the field under the escort of dozens of eunuchs and began to read His Majesty's decree. Prince Li Peiyan walked silently at the back of the crowd. Zhang Jing, the grand secretary of the imperial library, ranked last in the Tang cabinet. However, he was Song Song's biological father and had a special status. Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, was a cultivator and usually did not care about the court affairs. However, he and Ning Ke were old friends. Since Master Yen say, Ning Ke had to call him Uncle Master. His Majesty asked them to read the decree, so he naturally wanted to move them with affection. Sure enough, Ning Ke had to stand up and salute them when he saw them. Zhang Jing coughed twice and reached out to wipe off the snow on the imperial edict. He said, "His Majesty's decree." Everyone in front of the imperial city held their breath and pondered. Zhang Jing glanced at Prince Li Peiyan and sighed softly. Then he said bitterly, "Li Peiyan, Princey of the Tang Empire, requests to be stripped of his title due to the incident in the first year of Tianqi era." Everyone was silent. The people in front of the imperial city could not suppress their shock and looked at His Majesty. Li Peiyan's noble crown was still in the snow between Ning Ke and Xiao Ho, and it was about to be buried by the snow. His hair was a little messy and he looked a little embarrassed, but the expression on his face was unusually indifferent. Zhang Jing ignored the reaction of the crowd. He held the imperial edict with both hands and continued to read in a trembling voice. The case of the former Xianwei General Lin Guangyuan's treason is now revoked due to lack of evidence. The names on the imperial edict were read one by one through the Grand Secretary's trembling voice. His voice echoed in the wind and snow and hit the red wall. Xianwei General Lin Guangyuan, Mrs. Lin Guangyuan, Deputy General Xia Gang, Captain Cheng Xinzheng, Secretary Lin Hai, subordinate Hu Hua. Listening to the names that had long disappeared in history, listening to the imperial edicts that restored officials and conferred posthumous titles, there was dead silence in front of the imperial city. His Majesty's imperial edict did not mention reopening the old case. However, a prince requested to be stripped of his title, and all the soldiers involved were rehabilitated. What was the difference between this and reversing the case? People finally understood the meaning of the imperial palace. His Majesty had once thought of reversing the case of the Xianwei general's treason. However, because of the situation in the imperial court and the West Hill Divine Palace, especially the lack of evidence, he did not succeed. Today, the Academy tacitly allowed Ning Ke to challenge Xia Ho, which set a difficult problem for the imperial court. However, His Majesty could not reverse the case without evidence, so he chose this method. Even if it was not to reverse the case, it was still to reverse the case. At least this could give an explanation to those who died unjustly in Ningke today. When the imperial edict was read, Xia Ho stood up from his chair. His Majesty's imperial edict did not involve him, but he gradually frowned and slowly sat back down. Those names were still floating in the wind and snow. Xia Ho knew those names and had seen the people that those names represented. More than a decade ago, he had seen those people die in front of him with his own eyes. He had seen those heads piled up into a hill. Some eyes were closed, some eyes were open, and some eyes were filled with despair, while others were filled with anger. Those names were heard again after more than a decade. In front of the imperial city, they entered his ears. He became more and more silent, and his face became more and more livid. He held the armrest of the chair more and more tightly. He did not feel guilty, nor did he blame himself, nor was he sad. He was just angry. The armrest was reduced to dust, falling from the gaps between his fingers. With anger it landed on the snow. No one noticed General Xia Ho's emotions at this time, because His Majesty's imperial edict did not mention him. According to the law, he was no longer General Xia Ho. What he needed to do was to accept it calmly and then leave Chang'an. Everyone's eyes were on Ning Quebec. They knew who His Majesty's imperial edict was for. If they wanted to stop this duel of life and death, they could only hope that Ning Ke would withdraw the challenge invitation. His Majesty reversed the verdict for Lin Guangyuan, rewarded him generously, and favored him for 3 generations just for this. People in front of the imperial city looked at Ning Ke under the black umbrella and thought that this should be the end. From the moment he heard the name Lin Guangyuan, Ning Ke lowered his head and focused on the thick snow under his feet. He tilted his head and listened to the names on the imperial edict attentively. He had heard of those names before, so he listened very carefully today. But the expression on his face was very complicated, with some gratification, some disappointment, and some self-mockery. The names on the imperial edict were finally read. Grand Secretary Zheng Jing and Nation Master Li Qingshan walked to him and solemnly handed the imperial edict to him. Ning Ke took the imperial edict and remained silent. Li Qingshan looked solemn and said, "His Majesty said that as long as you admit to the previous murders, he will pardon you. After all, it is pardonable. If you think that the removal of the prince's title is not enough to compensate, His Majesty and Her Majesty will apologize to you on behalf of General Xia Ho and compensate you." The Nation Master spoke very softly and was covered by the wind and snow. Except for himself and Ning Ke, no one could hear him. But people could guess what he was talking about with Ning Quebec. However, Ning Ke made an unexpected decision, just when everyone thought that this was the end of the matter, and gradually relaxed. Ning Ke put the imperial edict on the chair behind him and looked at Li Qingshan, Zheng Jing, and the people in front of the imperial city. He laughed and then raised his hand. He began to clap. In the beginning, his movement was very gentle, but then it became more and more forceful, as if he was beating a wall. The wound on his palm burst open again and blood splashed everywhere. Clap, clap. Clap, clap, clap. Clap, 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 clap. The applause became louder and louder. Blood splashed from his palm and then dripped onto his body, his legs, and finally fell into the snow. Seeing this scene, the people in front of the imperial city felt a sense of coldness and horror again. Their bodies gradually became cold with the wind and snow. His Majesty is very kind. The law of the Tang Empire is indeed useful. It is very good to hear the names on the imperial edict resound in Chang, and again. I am very comforted. Ning Ke sighed and said, "It is a pity that some names are still forgotten. I am very sorry." Zhang Jing asked nervously, "Who else was left out?" "I will go to the palace to ask His Majesty right away." Ning Ke smiled and said, "I also left out many names in the general's mansion, such as the groom, the cook, the gardener, the maid, and my parents." Zhang Jing said in confusion. The first titles were the general and his wife. Ning Ke looked down at the snow under his feet and the blood spots on it. After a long silence he said, "The general and his wife are not my parents." As soon as he said this, the wind and snow suddenly dispersed. I finally wrote this part. I am very happy. There is one more chapter today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 472. Since a long time ago, the military had begun to investigate the connection between Ning Ke and those strange murder cases. Although they did not find any evidence, the rumor of his origin had already spread in Chang, and everyone believed that Ning Ke was the son of Xianwei General Lin Guangyun, the orphan of the massacre. He had been dormant in the world for many years and finally entered the academy. Once he gained power, he would start a bloody revenge. Even His Majesty, Xiahou, and many senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain of the academy believed this rumor. Therefore, at this time, when the people in front of the imperial city heard Ning Ke's words, they could not help but be shocked and could not believe it. They thought to themselves, "If you are not Lin Guangyuan's orphan, then why did you do these things?" Xiahou looked at Ning Ke under the black umbrella and frowned. No one knew what he was thinking. Ning Ke looked down at the blood spots that looked like plum blossoms on the snow. He seemed to see the blood spots on the ground in the woodshed 15 years ago, and a strange smile appeared on his face. The wind and snow suddenly scattered and gathered, gradually becoming faster and faster. Ning Ke raised his head, looked at the crowd and asked 3 questions. "Why do you all think I'm the general's son? Why must I be the general's son? Why do you all want me to be the general's son?" Everyone was still in a state of extreme shock and couldn't answer his question. Ning Ke laughed at himself and said, "Unfortunately, I'm not. My father is not the Xianwei general, not a captain, not a subordinate officer, not even a clerk. He is just a gatekeeper of the general's mansion, and a gatekeeper of the second gate. Even so, he doesn't get much. My mother was naturally not the general's wife. She was just a lowly servant girl. Although she had fed the young master and could enter the inner residence, she was still just a servant girl. Your Majesty has reversed the verdict for the general. I am very gratified. This is my true feeling because the general and his wife were good people. They died unjustly, but I am very regretful that I did not hear my parents' names." He looked at the crowd in front of the imperial city and said, "This is a very natural thing. My parents were originally unremarkable people, and their names were also very unremarkable. My father is an orphan. The general gave him the surname Lin. His name is Lin Tao. My mother didn't even have a name. She was sold to Chang'an from Hebei County. She was called Li Sanyang from her childhood until her death because she vaguely remembered that she was the 3rd child in her family." The blood continued to flow down Ning Ke's palm onto the snow. His expression was very calm, and so was his narration. It was not indifference but true calmness. However, this unemotional calmness made everyone who saw Ninkei's face feel a chill rising from the soles of their feet, and then their whole bodies froze. The calmness was frightening. Sang Sang was not afraid. She just felt what he was feeling at this moment. She felt his sadness and the coldness in his body and mind. She subconsciously reached out to hold his hand, wanting to give him some warmth. "I know, that's what's written in the books," Ninkei said calmly. The prince who was robbed of the throne left his hometown and returned to take revenge. A young master of a minister who was framed by a treacherous official escaped. Many years later, he became the top scholar and was favored by His Majesty. Then he reopened the case. He looked at the crowd and asked seriously, "But why must the protagonist of every revenge story be a prince? Is the son of a gatekeeper and a maidservant not qualified to take revenge?" Faced with this calm but powerful question, the people in front of the imperial city could only remain silent. Zhang Jing wanted to say something, but he could not open his mouth. Li Qingshan sighed softly. "That's what's written in the books, and that's what people think. I know that I can't blame anyone, and it's stupid to feel sorry for oneself. But I still hate this kind of thinking." Just like a dozen years ago, Ninkei looked at Xiaohou and said, "That day, I took the young master to play on the street as I often did, because he treated me as a good friend. That's a bit too much. Anyway, the housekeeper wanted to preserve the general's bloodline, so he took me to the mansion of the official of council across the street." Hearing this, Zhang Jing the Grand Secretary's expression slightly stiffened. He thought of the scene across the street when his wife, who was still a concubine, gave birth to a daughter and the scene of a river of blood across the street. Ninkei continued, "When you led the troops into the general's mansion, I was hiding in the woodshed of the official of council's mansion with the young master and the housekeeper." Xiaohou said gloomily, "My subordinates finally chased us to the woodshed and saw 2 dead bodies. At that time I was sure that Lin Guangyuan's son was dead, so I was very confused about your identity. Now I'm not confused anymore, but I'm curious about what you did at that time." Ninkei looked at the wind and snow around, as if he was recalling something. He smiled and said, "There's nothing new under Haotian. It's just the same old stories. If the general's son wanted to live, the gatekeeper's son had to die. They were both 4-year-old boys who were badly mutilated and changed their clothes. Who could recognize them? The housekeeper thought that there was no need to be vigilant against a 4-year-old boy, so he looked at me in a daze. His eyes were filled with apologies, sympathy, and sadness. At that moment I knew what he was going to do. He spread his hands and said with a smile, "Isn't that what's written in the book?" Then the smile on his face gradually faded. He looked at Xiaohou, Zhang Jing, Li Qingshan, and all the people he could see. He asked expressionlessly, "But why? Why should I do what is written in the book? Why the general's son wanted to live, but the gatekeeper's son had to die? Why should I die?" The wind and snow fell on the palace gate. Everyone was silent. No one could answer this question, so it was quiet. Only Ninkei's voice was still floating in the snow, and it was floating higher and higher, colder and colder. "I'm just the gatekeeper's son. But I want to live. I want to live." Ninkei's voice was calm and firm. He talked about his thoughts in the past, as if he was talking about the eternal truth that the sun must rise every day and the water must flow down. He continued, "So when the housekeeper tried to trick me into taking off my clothes and taking the chopper himself, I grabbed the chopper first and stabbed it into his stomach. I stabbed him more than once." Ninkei recalled what happened in the past and said with a frown, "It seemed to be 5 times. Because I didn't have enough strength, I couldn't stab him deeply enough, so I had to stab him a few more times. But I don't know why the housekeeper didn't scream. He just looked at me in horror, as if he was looking at a devil. All these years I've been thinking whether he was too scared to speak or he didn't want to alarm the people outside the woodshed." After a moment of silence he continued, "The young master, that is, the son of the general, did not know what happened at that time. He only saw the housekeeper, whom he had always loved the most, lying in a pool of blood. He rushed towards me as if he had gone mad. He wanted to hit me and bite me." He shook his head and said, "I was also very panicked at that time. I waved the chopper wildly and somehow cut his neck. Then he covered his neck and fell back on the woodpile." The blood in the young master's neck spurted out from the gaps between his fingers. I wanted to cover it for him, but I couldn't. In the end, his blood condensed into paste on my fingers. Ninkei raised his head and looked at the people in the snow. After a long silence, he shook his head and said, "It wasn't manslaughter. Maybe I wanted to kill him at that time." He looked at Xiaohou and said with a smile, "Because only if he died, people like you and His Highness would no longer care about me, the gatekeeper's son." The world was shrouded in the wind and snow, shrouded in a dead silence. The snowflakes drifted to Ninkei's face and touched his smile, which seemed to be even colder. It was a smile that seemed gentle but was actually extremely cold. People looked at the smile on Ninkei's face and were shocked speechless. They felt an unprecedented chill. They seemed to see the scene in the woodshed of the official of council's mansion more than a decade ago. A 4-year-old boy, holding a rusty chopper, stood in front of the two corpses. His face was full of despair and fear, and his body kept trembling, as if he could collapse at any time. But the boy didn't collapse. Now the boy was standing in the wind and snow, standing in front of the majestic palace, standing in front of people, telling the story of that long ago. The stories in the books were often written like that. The story he told was not in the books. On the first anniversary of the night, I finally told one of the stories I wanted to tell the most in this story. I feel very happy. 8 o'clock, crooked. 55373. Let's chat. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 473. On the precipice of the back mountain of the academy. The headmaster wore a black robe and sat on the edge of the cliff, looking at Chang and city in the distance. It was snowing heavily. From afar, it looked like Haotian was giving salt to the human world. 15 years ago, I sat here and looked at the woodshed of the official of council's mansion. The headmaster said, "I saw your youngest brother walk out of the woodshed with a machete in his hand. I saw him grab a rope and hide in the well. I saw him climb over the wall and walk into the crowd. I saw him leave Chang and city. It was as if I saw your youngest uncle's appearance a long time ago." Eldest brother stood aside and asked, "How did youngest brother and youngest uncle resemble each other?" The headmaster shook his head and said, "I don't know. Maybe it's the strong desire for freedom?" "I can understand why you said that about youngest uncle." Eldest brother asked confusedly, "But what does the tragedy that youngest brother encountered have to do with freedom?" The headmaster said, "The so-called freedom is the right to choose. Choose to live, choose to die, or choose not to choose. Back then your junior brother chose to pick up that hatchet and kill his housekeeper and his best playmate. At that moment he took his first step towards freedom." Eldest brother said, "Honestly, teacher, I don't understand." The headmaster said, "You are the clearest stream in the world. You have been flowing freely in the mountains all these years. Maybe you have encountered dangerous shoals and reefs, but you have never encountered a real fork in the river. You have never encountered the choice that your youngest brother faced. No one is qualified to judge whether the choice your junior brother made back then was right or wrong. However, the fact that he was able to make this choice is already extraordinary. Just like your junior uncle back then, no matter what kind of situation they face, they will only do what they want to do." Eldest brother said, "That's why you want to take youngest brother in." The headmaster said with emotion, "In the spring, when I met your youngest brother in the building of pines and cranes and talked to him in the hut, I found that he was different from your youngest uncle. I felt sorry at that time. But that's how the world is. How can two identical leaves be found?" The headmaster looked at the snow clouds in the distance in Chang, and city shrouded in the wind and snow. He said with relief, "But today, your youngest brother's choice still surprised me. I never thought that he would have the courage to challenge Xiaohou. I like the clumsiness in his choice." He turned to look at his eldest disciple and said with a smile, "Among the academy disciples, you are the clumsiest, so I like you the most. But in some aspects you really have to learn from Junemo and youngest brother." Eldest brother solemnly accepted the advice, but looking at the wind and snow in the distance, He could not suppress the worry in his heart. After hesitating for a moment, he said, "If youngest brother really loses to Xiahou, what should I do?" The words, "if" and "really" in this sentence were very meaningful. This meant that in the eyes of the eldest brother of the academy, Ning Ke and Xiahou were not powerless to fight. "I don't believe in heaven, nor do I believe in fate. I only believe in myself." The headmaster glanced at the dark winter sky and said, "Everyone can only believe in themselves. This is your youngest brother's own choice. It is his mockery and contempt for the heaven's way and destiny. Therefore, he needs nothing but a fair environment." The dead silence in front of the imperial city lasted for a long time. The increasingly violent wind and snow covered the blood flag, making the big black umbrella sway slightly, and the people's faces seemed to be frozen. Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, looked at Ning Ke with a complicated expression and said, "Is that it?" Ning Ke did not say anything. Li Qingshan sighed softly and shook his head helplessly. He said, "His Majesty said that if you insist on continuing this duel, then you must first hand over the item." He reached out his hand to Ning Ke and said, "You know what His Majesty said?" Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and asked why. Li Qingshan said, "Is this a personal grudge?" Ning Ke said yes. Li Qingshan said, "Since it is a personal grudge, how can you use the national weapon?" Then he said seriously, "If this duel is over and you are lucky enough to survive, then I will return the item to you." Ning Ke looked at the thick snow under his feet. After a moment of silence, he took out an item tightly wrapped in cloth from his arms, but he did not hand it to Li Qingshan. Li Qingshan frowned slightly and said, "Don't you even believe in me? I have always believed in no one but myself." "Sorry," Ning Ke said and then handed the item wrapped in cloth to Chan Pippi behind him. Li Qingshan smiled bitterly and no longer cared about what happened in the venue. Walking towards the imperial palace. The people in front of the palace gate did not know what Ning Ke took out from his arms, so they could not help but be curious. Xiahou clearly felt the faint fluctuation of aura from that item. He frowned slowly and looked at Ning Ke and said, "So the array is really in your hands. No wonder you are so bold to challenge me." Ning Ke said, "I have said before that I still have many powerful means." Xiahou slowly stroked the armrest of the chair, as if he did not notice that there was nothing there. He said, "Now that the array has been taken, you still insist on killing me?" Ning Ke said, "You have killed a lot of people and so have I. People like us should be very clear that there are many ways to kill people." Xiahou said indifferently, "You know you will definitely die, but you still insist on killing me. Is it for revenge? Can a 4-year-old boy have such a long memory? Can you remember the faces of your parents? I don't believe it at all. I think you just can't get rid of the psychological shadow of that year." Hearing this, Ning Ke said, "I have to admit that my hands are very uncomfortable with young master's blood. I can't wash them clean no matter how I wash them. My fingers are always sticky. Maybe I do have a psychological shadow. I used a hatchet to kill people for the first time, and then I got used to using a knife." He looked at Xiahou and said, "But so what? What's the point of saying this?" Xiahou slightly raised his eyebrows and showed a look of ridicule and contempt on his face. He said, "At least it can prove that your revenge is not as great and righteous as you think." "Great and righteous?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "After escaping from Chang'an, I have imagined countless times over the years. One day, I will meet an extraordinary person in the mountains and inherit a peerless skill. What will I say before I break into the military camp to kill you? I will ask you why you are so cruel and murderous. I will say that killing you today is to seek justice for the ghosts in the general's mansion, the burnt corpses in the villages in the Yen territory, and all the innocent people who died. The list is very long and I added a very good friend to it at the end." Speaking of this, he looked at Xiahou and said with slight mockery, "These are some very awe-inspiring and righteous words, but what does it have to do with me?" The cold wind and snow attacked his body. Ning Ke covered his mouth with his fist and coughed twice. Then he spat a thick phlegm into the snow. The yellow phlegm was very eye-catching in the clean snow. "I have killed no less people than you, and I have also done many evil things that others can't imagine. My hands are never clean. and I am not a messenger of justice. He looked at Xiahou and said, no matter how many innocent people you kill, it has nothing to do with me. As long as it has nothing to do with me, I can even applaud you. But since you have killed my family, I will naturally kill you. This is a matter of course, and I don't need any other reason. Xiahou was silent for a long time, and suddenly said, a little interesting. Then he stood up from the chair. It was as if an indestructible mountain had suddenly appeared in the snowstorm. Come and kill me, he finally said, or be killed by me and end your painful life. The city of Chang, and at dusk was like falling into the eternal night. The thick snow clouds covered the last afterglow and the sky full of stars. It was dark beside Yanming Lake, and only the distant torches illuminated the falling snow, turning the dense and whistling snow into the human world starlight. Xiahou looked at the closed courtyard door in front of him expressionlessly. He reached back and took the military flag from his bodyguard. He walked to the front of the courtyard door, holding the military flag in his right hand and pointing it down. His movement was very casual. The ground in front of the courtyard door was hard stone. When the flagpole fell, the stone ground was broken into pieces, splashing countless gravel, and the end of the flagpole was deeply inserted into the mud. Xiahou slowly loosened his palm. The flagpole was firm as if it was born from the ground. The blood-red military flag fluttered in the sky full of snow, engulfing all the night. This blood-red Royal General flag had accompanied Xiahou for many years. Whether it was fighting with the Yan Kingdom army or the cavalry of the left king's palace, this flag had always been flying in the northeast border military of the Tang Empire. Over the past few decades, this blood flag had never fallen. Just like the powerful man under the blood flag, the bodyguards at the periphery of Yanming Lake, the vigilant ministers, and the local government runners of Cha, and local government who maintained order, all looked at the blood flag in the night and had a strong feeling. Tonight, this blood-red flag would still not fall. Xiahou walked up the stone steps. Then he pushed open the courtyard door. So he walked into the night. Ning Ke was not in the house by Yanming Lake. He and Sang Sang were standing on Yanming Mountain on the south bank, overlooking the distant opposite bank. Sang Sang held the big black umbrella to block the increasingly violent snow. In the eyes of the world, Ning Ke's most powerful cultivation state was talisman and arrow. To fight with Xiahou, a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, it was natural for him to keep a distance. Although Xiahou did not know where Ning Ke was at this time, he could guess it. However, as proud and confident as he was, he did not care about it at all. But tonight, the wind and snow were strong and the night sky covered the stars. In the cold winter, Yanming Lake was like a frozen inkstone. No matter how sharp Ning Ke's senses were, he could not see the scene on the opposite bank. If he could not see, then how could the primordial 13 arrows hit the enemy? That's all for today. I need to sort it out and delete some. 2 chapters tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 474. This snow seems to be unfair to me, but it is actually unfair to Xiahou. Ning Ke looked at the other side of the lake and the snow on the lake. He shook his head and continued. His Majesty took away the Arai pestle, which naturally doesn't make me happy, but it is fair. My cultivation state is far lower than Xiahou's, so it seems unfair. But in fact, I have prepared for 15 years, and he doesn't know that there is a person like me in the world who has been watching him silently, so the unfairness here is even. As long as this battle is limited to me and him, then I will admit that it is fair. Sang Sang held the handle of the big black umbrella tightly, and shrank her body to ensure that the umbrella would not be blown away by the violent snow. She whispered, "Young master, are you worried that someone will intervene?" After all, Xiahou is a visiting professor of Haotian Taoism besides being a general of the empire. I always feel that someone will interrupt this battle. I did feel something when I held the Arai pestle. Ning Ke thought of his peers in the academy and said, "But I am not worried because this is Chang and not other places. As long as the academy is still in the south of the city, no one is qualified to intervene." Perhaps some forces wanted to intervene in this battle, but more people were just silently waiting for the battle to begin by the Yanming Lake, such as Yisu, who had left the small Taoist temple. The best place to watch a battle was, of course, a high place. At this time he was on the city wall of Chang'an, and his plain white robe was fluttering in the night snow. Many people thought that the West Hill Divine Palace did not want to see the battle between Xiahou and Ning Quebec. In fact, the envoy of the Divine Hall had indeed raised objections to the Imperial Palace, but he who came to Chang'an on behalf of Haotian Taoism could ignore the Divine Hall's attitude. Although he also wanted to see Xiahou retire safely, he did not mind the battle happening, because no matter how Yisu deduced, he could not imagine that Ningke could win. It was good that Xiahou could win. It was better that Xiahou killed Ningke and offended the academy, because then, he could no longer stay in the Tang Empire and retire peacefully, nor could he waver on the wall. He could only pledge his loyalty to Haotian Taoism. Although the Dao Sect's idea is good, we must first ensure that Xiahou can win. A voice rang out from the top of the city wall. This person spoke very slowly, but his voice was still very clear in the snowstorm. It seemed to be able to calm people's hearts. Eldest brother walked to Yisu's side and looked in the direction of the dark Yanming Lake below the city wall. Yisu said, "We just met in the morning and you're here again?" Eldest brother said, "Yes, I'm here to take a look." Yisu asked, "What are you here to see?" Eldest brother looked at Yisu and said with a smile, "Now that your sword style is calm, there is no one else but Mr. Liu Bai who can beat you in Chang'an. That's why I came to see you. Looking at you is actually looking at you." Yisu looked at the falling snow in front of the city wall and said expressionlessly, "No one in Chang'an is my match, but there is an academy outside the city." Tonight the wind and snow were furious. Many people were sitting peacefully in the snow. The third minister of offerings of Qinghe County sat in the winter forest on the east bank of Yanming Lake. The night snow fell from the sky. He looked indifferent, as if he did not feel the coldness around him. Considering the interests of the Qinghe County families and Her Highness, he could not allow anyone to disturb this battle. However, he had a feeling earlier, so he came to the forest and waited silently. A monk walked slowly in the night snow. It was dark in the forest, but the monk's cotton kasaya and the bamboo hat on his head could be clearly seen, naturally revealing a sense of righteousness. The third minister of offerings looked at the monk walking in the wind and snow and frowned slightly. A few years ago, he was already a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. However, at this moment, he found that he could not see through the monk's depth. He could not help but be extremely vigilant and have a desire to fight. When powerhouses confronted each other, they fought for a moment. There was no need for any verbal probing, nor was there a need to ask about the origin of the mountain. The third minister of offerings reached behind him and pulled out the hilt of his sword. The sword rubbed against the edge of the scabbard, making a very subtle sound, like snowflakes falling on a thick layer of snow. However, the sword was only pulled out halfway before it was forced to stop. The third minister of offerings' eyebrows gradually rose. His hand holding the hilt of his sword trembled slightly, and all the cultivation in his body spurted out. However, the sword in the scabbard behind him did not continue to be pulled out. Instead, it slowly returned to the scabbard. The sound of the sword rubbing against the scabbard was as quiet as falling snow, but it made his heart palpitate. The monk wearing the bamboo hat walked slowly in the wind and snow, and was only a few feet away from him. The third minister of offerings' body was extremely stiff. His hand holding the hilt of his sword trembled like a withered branch in the snow. Looking at the monk, there was only fear left in his usually proud eyes. The monk did not make any move. There was no change in the aura of heaven and earth in the snow forest. He just walked slowly, and yet a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state could not pull out his sword. The third minister of offerings was extremely shocked. He could not imagine any cultivator in the world who could have such a skill. In a flash, he guessed the monk's origin and his pupil shrank. Someone from the Xiankong temple? The third priest looked at the monk who was getting closer and closer. He looked at the monk's gentle and determined eyes. His stiff body began to tremble slightly in fear. He let out a muffled groan and his face suddenly turned red. His skinny fingers suddenly spread out and escaped the traces of the aura of heaven and earth floating in the snow forest. He wanted to escape from the monk's control. The monk raised his right palm in front of him. He bent his index finger slightly and made an unknown emblematic gesture. The wind and snow in the winter forest suddenly became stronger. Thousands of snowflakes seemed to fall on the third minister of offerings of Qinghe County. The snowflakes sensed the supreme power of the monk's emblematic gesture and sank into the third minister of offerings' clothes. They turned into countless invisible snow ropes and tied him up. The monk glanced at him, his eyes full of benevolence and pity. Then he started walking again, stepping on the thick snow, walking past him, as if he was walking towards the lakeside outside the winter forest. The third minister of offerings sat alone in the snow. He could not move at all. His flushed cheeks had already become extremely pale. His eyes were filled with shame and fear. He was the respected ancestor of Qinghe County. After his cultivation entered the knowing destiny state, he became even more arrogant and confident. He did not even have much respect for the legendary unknown place like the academy. On this snowy night he finally met a monk from the unknown place. He finally understood that a legend was just a legend. In front of the monk, even a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state did not have the slightest qualification to be arrogant. The third minister of offerings thought of how he had boasted shamelessly in the princess mansion. He said that he wanted to create some disputes between the academy and Haotian Taoism. Now he was tied up in the snow by the monk's emblematic gesture. He could not help but feel endless shame and wish that he could die. On the high city wall, Yisu waved his hand to disperse the snowflakes within 50 feet in front of him. He looked at the dark forest by the Yanming Lake and said coldly, "That idiot from Qinghe County is extremely stupid. Even a small stem borer wants to be involved in the torrent. It's really disgusting." The eldest brother smiled and did not say anything. Yisu said, "I wanted to kill that idiot. But since the mute has taken action, forget it." The eldest brother shook his head and said, "How can I watch you violate the laws of the Tang Empire?" Yisu smiled slightly when he heard the words, "the laws of the Tang Empire." Eldest brother looked at the shore of Yanming Lake and thought of the monk who was walking through the winter forest to the lakeside. He said, "The battle between youngest brother and General Xiahou is probably a grand event in the eyes of many people in the world. That is why you came to Chang'an. I just hope that nothing happens to youngest brother." Yisu said, "You know that I came to Chang and not because of this battle, but because of Ning Quebec. That mute is naturally here for Ning Quebec." The eldest brother was very clear about what Yisu wanted to say, but he remained silent and did not answer. Yisu looked at the Yanming Lake and suddenly said with emotion, "Those people who appeared around the Black Line 15 years ago. Except for Tang, all of us are here." The eldest brother said, "Actually, Tang is here too. The injuries on General Xiahou were all caused by him. So even though he did not come, his fists did." Yisu said, "That makes sense. But even if Xiahou has countless fists left by Tang, in my opinion, Ningke still has no chance in this cross-state battle. I know what you want to say and what you are worried about. I respect youngest brother, so I will not do anything." The eldest brother smiled and said, "Of course, I know that if youngest brother knew what the academy is thinking, he would definitely cry and beg me not to respect him." Yisu said, "What does Mr. Second mean by stopping Su Shur on the snow bridge?" The eldest brother said, "It means fairness." Yisu said, "Xiahou is far more powerful than Ning Quebec. Does the academy think this is also fair?" The eldest brother said, "Teacher once taught us that fairness is the intention and has nothing to do with strength. As long as both sides are willing to do so and accept the rules, then it is fair." Yisu was silent for a long time as he thought of the words of the headmaster of the academy. Then he looked at the night forest by the Yanming Lake and frowned slightly. He said, "If that mute wants to speak, there are few people in this world who can stop him." Yisu turned to look at him and asked, "Junimo is stopping Su Shur, and you are looking at me. Then who can stop him?" "I will not stop him. And the moment he speaks, even I cannot stop him. Do we need to alarm the headmaster of the academy?" The eldest brother looked at the lake in the cold winter night and frowned in silence. The snow was dancing. The monk walked in the forest towards the Yanming Lake. 15 years ago, in front of the black line, he smiled slightly, chewed his tongue and swallowed it. He never spoke again and had been practicing the silent meditation ever since. Tonight he stepped into the mortal world again. No one knew if he would speak or what he would say. People only knew that he had been silent for 15 years. Once he opened his mouth, the Buddha's voice would be as clear as thunder. Even Yisu, the powerful successor of the Jisho Abbey, did not want to hear the first sentence he would say. Who would talk to the monk? Did the headmaster of the academy really need to come down the mountain? At this moment, a very thin layer of snow fell from the night forest. The snow was extremely thin, so thin that it was translucent like a cicada's wing. I'm going to pick up the leader and then go back to my parents' home with her. The second chapter will be updated very late. I have to report to everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 475. It was windy and snowy in the forest at night. However, the seemingly light snow was not blown away by the howling night wind, nor did it disappear into the dense snow. Instead, it fell from the sky alone and arrogantly, ignoring the surrounding wind and its companions. It slowly floated down and landed on the shoulder of the third minister of offerings. The third minister of offerings of Qinghe County was bound by the monk's emblematic gesture. He sat cross-legged in the snow and could not move at all. He could only watch the thin snow fall on his shoulder and could not help but feel confused. When the thin snow fell, the monk stopped walking toward the lakeside. His straw sandals sunk deep into the thick snow. Then he turned around and looked at the thin snow in silence. Suddenly there was a rustling sound in the forest. The sound was like sharp pieces of ice rubbing against each other. Accompanied by the wind and snow, it was naturally mournful and sounded like the chirping of cicadas. Cicadas were creatures of summer, and would be silent in the autumn wind. In this context, cold cicadas were silent. However, the wind and snow were cold tonight, and there seemed to be countless cicadas in the forest. Those cicadas hid behind the branches, in the upturned bark, hanging between the spider webs, and sitting in the ice and snow. They watched the falling snow and the monk in the wind and snow, chirping wantonly. The cicadas kept chirping. The forest was full of cold cicadas. The chirping of the cicadas in the forest became more and more intense and mournful. The thick snow on the branches was shaken and fell down. However, there seemed to be two large and invisible cicada wings above the forest by the lake, covering the whole sky and preventing the chirping of the cicadas from spilling out of the forest. The mournful chirping of the cicadas was colder than the snow and more elusive than the night wind. It sounded everywhere, returned to silence and revived everywhere. Finally, it fell into the ears of the monk. The chirping of the cicadas in the forest seemed to be indifferently saying, "Repent and you will be saved." The monk listened to the increasingly mournful chirping of the cicadas, and his expression became more and more solemn. His name was Qin Yan. He came from the Xiankong Temple, and was a powerful world wayfarer of the Buddhism sect. Because of the records in the temple, he came to Chang, and to see the legendary son of Yama. He was even ready to kill that person even if he had to face the academy. Ever since he started to practice silent meditation, his Zen heart and willpower had become firmer and firmer. Even the countless powerhouses in Chang, and in the mountain of the academy in the south of the city could not move him. Logically speaking, no sound should be able to stop his footsteps. But these cicadas were different, because he knew that these cicadas represented a person. He was the most mysterious person in the world, and could even be said to be the most terrifying person in the world. Even if the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong Temple was here, he would have to treat the cicadas with the utmost caution. Qin Yan's expression was solemn, even with the respect that a junior should have. But his eyes were still firm, and he slowly pointed to the Yanming Lake behind him. He used this action to tell the person behind the cicada that his higan was over there. The third minister of offerings of Qinghe County was tied up by the snow rope made by the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect and could not move at all. But he could see, hear the mournful chirping of cicadas in the forest. Looking at the thin snow on his shoulder, his face became paler and paler, and his expression became more and more frightened. He was a grand cultivator of the knowing destiny state, and he knew many secrets of the cultivation world in the Qinghe County book collection. Although he was not sure, he had vaguely guessed the identity of the person in the forest. To cause the cicadas to cry in such a snowy night, and to make the Vedanta of the Xiankong temple so solemn, it could only be the most mysterious master of the devil's doctrine in the world, the 23-year cicada cultivation. After the front gate of the devil's doctrine was destroyed, the force that had once set off bloody storms in the world had withered. But no one dared to ignore the current master of the devil's doctrine. For many years, no one had seen the master of the devil's doctrine, or even heard of him. So the master became the most mysterious legend in the cultivation world. Rumor had it that the master of the devil's doctrine was possessed by the devil while practicing the 23-year cicada cultivation, and had already turned into a pile of bones. But some people also said that the master of the devil's doctrine was hiding somewhere in the world, watching the world indifferently, and might appear at any time to summon the wind and rain again. But no matter what, no one in the cultivation world would forget this person. Even those who believed that he was dead, in fact, were frightened and uneasy at night. They always felt that one day, the master of the devil's doctrine would reappear in front of the world at a moment that no one could imagine. It was indeed a moment that no one could imagine. At least it was a moment that the third minister of offerings of Qinghe County could not imagine. Just before the decisive battle between Ningke of the Academy and General Xiahou, the world wayfarers of Taoism and Buddhism sects arrived in Chang'an. 23-year cicada cultivation actually reappeared in the world. The third minister of offerings was terrified. But then, he thought that the master of the devil's doctrine was confronting the Vedanta of Xiankong temple, and he thought that he might have a chance to survive. His eyes rolled subconsciously. His eyes turned slightly, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the snow on his shoulder that was as thin as a cicada's wing. Then he remembered that he had forgotten something in the legend. According to the legend, the master of the devil's doctrine did not kill many people because he disdained to kill ordinary people. He thought that only grand cultivators in the knowing destiny state were qualified to be killed by him. According to the legend, the reason why the master of the devil's doctrine was the most mysterious person in the world was that he would kill everyone who had heard the sound of cicadas. The third minister of offerings was in the knowing destiny state, and he had heard the sound of cicadas tonight. The third minister of offerings understood this, and then he died. The snowflake that was as thin as a cicada's wing flapped its wings and gently wedged itself into his old neck. Blood spurted out from his neck and sprayed into the wind and snow, making a hissing sound. It was also like the sound of cicadas. The sound of cicadas was the sound of the vibration of the drum of cicadas. It could vibrate thousands of times in an instant. Therefore it could tear silk when it was clear, make people cry when it was sad, and make them feel sad when it was bleak. The sound of blood splashing was the vibration of the friction between the blood and the wound. It was similar to the sound of cicadas, so the sound was similar and could be equally sad. The mute monk turned around and looked at the third minister of offerings of Qinghe County, who was sitting cross-legged in the deep snow. He frowned slightly, knowing that this was a warning from the man in the forest. He was a disciple of Buddhism. He could kill people, but he did not want to. That was why he used the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect to bind the minister of offerings. However, he did not expect that he would become the accomplice of the powerhouse from the devil's doctrine. The monk knew why the 23-year cicada cultivation reappeared in the world, and why it used the sound of cicadas to stop him from going to Yanming Lake. Because Xiahou was a traitor of the devil's doctrine, and he was someone that the 23-year cicada cultivation had to kill. If the master of the devil's doctrine was really dead, then it would be fine. But since he was still alive, he had to kill Xiahou or watch him die. The master of the devil's doctrine had probably endured for many years because of the Academy and the imperial court of the Tang Empire. Now that the Academy had decided to kill Xiahou, how could he allow others to intervene? The 23-year cicada cultivation might be afraid of the headmaster of the academy, but he would never be afraid of the Xiankong Temple or the Jishou Abbey. The mute monk could understand the intention of the sound of cicadas, but it did not mean that he could accept it. The Buddhism sect had always been called the Outer Way by the Haotian Taoism sect, but it belonged to the righteous way after all. Although he knew that the powerhouse from the devil's doctrine in the forest was unfathomable, how could someone as strong-willed as him stop? He was Qin Yan, the successor of the Xiankong Temple. He began to get angry, but it was anger. It was not coquettishness nor anger. The monk still pressed his lips tightly together, and his eyes were firm. His hands were constantly changing in front of the cotton kasaya, and in a moment they formed a cold emblematic gesture. It was the brightest and most powerful emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect, the Akalanatha gesture. The two seemingly ordinary fingers in front of the old kasaya curled up like orchids, and the majestic aura followed the direction of the emblematic gesture and scattered around the snow forest. Silently, the snow in the forest suddenly scattered into the sky, and suddenly the wind and snow in the air stopped. The sound of cicadas, which seemed to be everywhere in the night forest, also stopped. However, then the sound of cicadas sounded again, and this time it was brighter and more violent. It seemed that a person was laughing loudly. The wind and snow in the forest became stronger, and the snow fell even faster. The snow that had just been shaken up from the ground instantly covered the ground again, and the snowflakes in the air were shooting at Qin Yan's body. Qin Yan's expression did not change. He lightly stepped on the snow with his straw sandals, and bounced his right calf to hit the bend of his left knee. Then he sat on the snow like a half-snow lotus. The flying snowflakes were like countless cicadas, whizzing and hitting Qin Yan's body. There seemed to be an invisible barrier on the surface of Qin Yan's body. When the snowflakes were half an inch away from his body, they could no longer move forward. However, the snowflakes did not fall, but stuck to the surface of his body like cotton. In a moment, his kasaya was covered with snow, and only his face and hands with the Akalanatha gesture were outside. He looked like a snowman. Qin Yan looked into the depths of the night forest and saw the frost on his eyelashes. The muscles on his cheeks twitched slightly, and he seemed to be hesitating whether to say something or not. He had practiced the silent meditation for 15 years, and he was finally going to speak tonight? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the depths of the night forest. That voice was so quiet and peaceful. It was a sharp contrast with the irritated cicadas in the forest. However, the words that came out of such a tranquil voice were so cold. If you speak, I will make 100,000 mutes in the world. Hearing this, the monk was furious. He opened his eyes wide and looked into the depths of the night forest. The frost on his eyelashes evaporated, and the snow on his body turned into warm water and dripped down. He knew that even if he spoke tonight, he might not be able to defeat that person. But that person could definitely set off a bloody storm in the world. If he was facing Mr. First, Mr. Second, or even the headmaster of the academy, the monk could ignore them, because he knew that the academy would not be so shameless. But that person was 23-year cicada cultivation. That person could do anything. So he was angry, but he still could not speak. After saying this, the person in the depths of the night forest did not speak again. But Qin Yan knew that he was still here, because the cicadas were still chirping. The monk could not speak, nor could he sigh. He could only sigh softly in his heart, and then disperse the Akalanatha seal. He put his palms together to guard his heart, and then slowly closed his eyes. The snowflakes continued to fall like cicadas, covering the monk's body and covering his facial features, turning the successor of Xiankong Temple into a snowman in the night forest. The snow that had been falling for a whole day and night suddenly became lighter at this time. The chirping of cicadas in the forest gradually became weaker, but it became more and more sad. Cold cicadas were sad. Facing the winter lake, the heavy snow had just stopped. Let me be excited. This is also the picture that I have been writing for a whole year. Maybe half of the fun of writing a novel is here. Tomorrow is Saturday. See you the day after tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 476. Beside the Yanming Lake, the mountains on the south bank and the snow forest on the east bank were all quiet. There was no sound, let alone the sound of cicadas. On the city wall, eldest brother and Yisu looked through the heavy snow and fell on the forest. Their expressions were slightly strange, as if they felt something was happening there. However, they did not have the energy to pay attention to what was happening in the snow forest, because they saw the blood flag fluttering in front of the Yanming Lake house. Xiaohou pushed the door open and entered. The courtyard door was a little new, as if it had been repaired not long ago. Xiaohou pushed the door open and entered the dark courtyard. He suddenly heard the sound of cicadas, and his body could not help but stiffen. During the day in the imperial palace, he also vaguely heard the sound of cicadas coming from the dancing snowflakes in front of the hall. He was sure that it was an auditory hallucination, but at this time, although the sound was still unreal, it seemed to be a little real. The indifferent expression on Xiaohou's face did not change at all. He slightly raised his eyebrows and looked more violent. He steadily stepped over the threshold and walked through the corridor to the main hall. There was a short pause in the snow, and then it flew more violently. Thick clouds covered the sky full of stars, and the wind and snow dimmed the lights in Chang'an. It was so dark beside the Yanming Lake that one could not see his fingers in front of him, but Xiaohou could see everything clearly. There were a few winter plums planted under the stone steps. For some reason, the plum branches were scattered, and fresh stubble could be seen under the snow. It seemed that they had been eaten by some elegant animals. There was a pot of green plant in the house. Even in the cold winter, the plant was still growing vigorously. Its branches and leaves were plump and green, which made the yellow soil in the pot even more boring. The thick and straight black beam on the roof was slightly deformed. It should have been hit by some kind of impact, and there were two very small cracks on it. It did not seem to affect safety, but it was still a little scary to look at. On the side of the unique display shelf, there was an oil lamp. The oil lamp was made of celadone, and the lamp string was white. When it was not lit, it was also a very beautiful work of art. Ningke had spent countless taels of silver on this house by the Yanming Lake, and Mr. Qi had spent a lot of effort on it. Moreover, it had been bought by Her Majesty and Liu, so it was extraordinary. Compared with those famous gardens in Qinghe County, it was not inferior. Even the inconspicuous things were worth appreciating. Xiaohou was a general and would never be sentimental about the changing seasons. Naturally, he had no interest in this aspect. However, in the face of a great battle, his gaze on the plum bushes, black beams, bonsai, and oil lamp was so focused. In fact, he did not look at the plum bushes, the black beams, the bonsai, or the oil lamp. He was looking at the yellow paper peeking out from the snow on the plum trees, the yellow paper stuck between the cracks of the black beams, the yellow paper in the bonsai, the yellow paper under the celadone lamp. In this world, there was a kind of paper that was usually yellowish. It was called fu paper. There were talisman papers everywhere in the house by the Yanming Lake. This was a residence made of talismans. The reason why Yi Hongyu could defeat Chun Pippi was that she knew him and knew his fear. I also know Xiaohou very well. Since the day he betrayed the devil's doctrine, Xiaohou has been afraid. Maybe he was afraid of the mysterious grandmaster of the devil's doctrine, or maybe he was afraid that the West Hill Divine Palace would expose his identity. Because of fear, he felt empty. He began to kill people like flies and began to be cruel and arrogant. Ningke took the big black umbrella from Sang Sang and looked at the courtyard shrouded in the night snow. Only in this way can he get rid of his psychological shadow. What he said in front of the palace gates was right. I also have a psychological shadow, so I understand that his pride is a fatal weakness that he cannot get rid of. Because of his pride, he has now stepped into the battlefield that I have chosen. This is the first mistake he has made. How to make use of his mistake? I don't know. I only know that I must not hesitate to use more than 300 talismans that I have painstakingly written in the past 2 years. Writing talismans was not as casual as it seemed. Except for Ningke himself, Not many people knew how many sleepless nights he had spent writing more than 300 talismans, how many times his psyche power was exhausted, and how many times his sense of perception had been shaken. Zhang Sang knew. Because of those nights accompanied by oil lamps, she had been waiting by Ning Kei's side. She saw him sweat like beans and his face was pale, but he still wrote. In those nights, Ning Kei was not plowing the fields, nor writing the articles but only the talismans. On the edge of the cliff in the snow, Sang Sang looked up at Ning Quebec, seeing that his face was as pale as those nights. She was very worried. But she smiled and said, "Yes, young master will definitely win." Ning Kei closed his eyes and held the handle of the umbrella. His eyebrows and right hand were trembling, and his face was pale. The psyche power in his sense of perception spread along the black umbrella into the snow-filled sky. Psyche power was the foundation of orthodox cultivators. However, cultivators could only use psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and then use various means. Even if a psyche master could directly attack the enemy with psyche power, it was limited to a very short distance. That was because psyche power had a characteristic that could not be changed. This characteristic was that once the psyche power left the cultivator's sense of perception, it would rapidly disperse with the distance and return to nature. Ning Kei was standing on the cliff on the south bank of Yanming Lake. He was a few miles away from the courtyard on the other side of the lake. If he wanted to trigger the 300 talismans hidden in the courtyard, he needed to send his psyche power to the other side. However, how could his psyche power cross the winter lake in the night snow? At this moment something amazing happened. After his psyche power passed through the handle and the surface of the big black umbrella, there was an obvious change. It was not that the concentration of the psyche power had increased, but the speed at which it dispersed into the snow had slowed down. Because of the acupoint obstruction tune in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, the aura of heaven and earth around the lake could not understand the song that he sang with his psyche power. But at least his voice could travel further. Ning Kei's psyche power quietly passed through the wind and snow and landed in the courtyard on the opposite bank. The yellow paper that was under the celadone lamp turned into nothingness with a slight sound. A faint sense of dryness came out of nowhere. The white, jade-like lamp rope that had never been lit suddenly tightened. The oil was released and a weak flame was ignited. The oil lamp was dim, but it slightly illuminated the inside and outside of the hall. As the celadone lamp strangely ignited without fire, there were countless changes in the room. The display shelf where the oil lamp was located was completely ignited. However, the space where the display shelf was also ignited, turning into a blazing fireball that covered Xiaoho's mountain-like body. The fire was faintly discernible and terrifying. Wherever it passed, everything was turned into nothingness. Only the green plant in the pot was different. The slightly drooping, green and tender green leaves melted like fat when they were burned by the tongue of fire in the room. They turned into light green oil and dripped into the flower pot. The yellow fu paper that was stuck in the green leaf disappeared. The green leaf turned into oil and fell into the soil. The flower pot suddenly cracked and the yellow soil inside exploded, filling the space in the room. The granular yellow dust was unknowingly extremely heavy. Every grain of gravel was like a stone, shooting towards Xiaoho's body. Then the yellow paper on the black beam disappeared into thin air. With a loud crack, the heavy beam broke from the middle without warning and smashed towards Xiaoho's head. Xiaoho squinted his eyes. His iron-like eyebrows were not furrowed. They reflected the fire and seemed to be burning. He punched. That terrifying fist was so domineering that it squeezed out all the air in front of him. The blazing talisman fire was suddenly extinguished. It was extremely gloomy. He closed his eyes. He let the yellow gravel hit his body like stones. There was a series of crackling sounds. Countless tiny but powerful pieces of gravel smashed into his body. It was like countless hailstones falling from the sky and hitting the eaves of the palace. The robe on his body was instantly riddled with holes, but there was no expression on his face. He lowered his head. The two halves of the black beam smashed into his back. Then it broke into more pieces. The heavy beam could kill a dozen people, but it could not make his body tremble. Facing Ning Kei's 3 talismans, Xiahou only punched. This was the peak of martial arts. Especially since he was originally a powerhouse of the Devil's Doctrine. He could ignore any attack below the knowing destiny state as long as he closed his eyes. The yellow gravel that shot out like flying stones did not leave any mark on his face. The broken beam rolled and groaned under his feet. He was not hurt at all. Only one eyelash floated away from his eyes. With Xiahou's cultivation state, he did not have to face Ningke's 3 talismans directly. He could have avoided them. He could have used the simplest way to break them with a wave of his hand. The reason why he did not do so was that he had been paying attention to the broken plum flowers under the stone steps behind him. Ningke thought he knew him very well. He also thought he knew Ningke very well. He knew how cold and sinister Ningke was. He believed that Ningke would never waste 3 precious talismans just to test his strength. There must be a backup plan. There was also a yellow talisman in the broken plum flowers. Xiahou thought it was Ningke's killing move, so he focused on it. As expected, the next moment, the yellow talisman in the broken plum flowers turned into a wisp of smoke. The few remaining plum flowers trembled and left the branches. They flew like butterflies to the back of Xiahou's head. Xiahou did not look back. He casually pointed behind him. When his fingertips touched the plum petal, his iron eyebrows suddenly frowned. The petal turned into a drop of water. The talisman in the broken plum flowers turned out to be such a shallow water talisman. Xiahou frowned because he found that he had made a mistake in his judgment. But he did not care. He looked up with an indifferent expression. The black beam had been broken. There was a big hole in the roof. People under the eaves could see the starry sky when they looked up. It was windy and snowy tonight. There were no stars to see. Only countless snowflakes could be seen pouring in from the hole along with the night wind. There was also a talisman that was gradually dissipating into coldness. The snowflakes that fell from the hole seemed to have grown many times larger as they danced in the air. An extremely cold talisman suddenly enveloped the entire building. Even the air in the building froze. Xiahou looked up at the falling snow. His eyebrows were instantly covered with a thick layer of frost. I was too excited when I wrote the 2 chapters the day before yesterday, which resulted in a serious increase in typos. I have changed them in the document. The mistakes in the VIP chapter will not be dealt with for technical reasons. I am going to massage and drink. Have a good weekend. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 477. This was a very powerful talisman. In a twinkling of an eye, the temperature in the house dropped sharply. Xiahou's eyebrows were stained with frost, and the surface of the armor inside his coat also began to freeze. For a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, this cold talisman was powerful, but it still could not cause direct harm. He frowned slightly, and the frost on his eyebrows suddenly broke. Then he took a step forward, and the thin ice on the armor also broke and fell to the ground. But at least at this moment, Xiahou needed to condense the chi of heaven and earth on the surface of his body with psyche power. He could no longer use his strong body and fists to fight against it as before. The battle in the lakeside house did not temporarily come to an end. In the next moment, countless yellow fu paper shot out from the inconspicuous corners of the house. The dense yellow talisman papers fluttered in the air like snowflakes falling from the hole in the roof. They danced and rotated around Xiahou's body. As the psyche power came from an unknown place, the yellow fu paper flying like snowflakes were triggered one by one. They turned into illusions or wisps of green smoke, and the talisman power spurted out. Then the talisman power that was triggered first drove the untriggered fu paper to fly faster. The yellow fu paper in the lakeside house spouted like a waterfall, illuminating the night sky. This scene was very beautiful and shocking. Fu paper was so precious. In the past cultivation battles, who had ever seen so many fu paper appear at the same time? Immediately after, more talisman papers were activated. Countless talisman wills intertwined together, tearing the surrounding world's yuan qi into countless turbulent streams. The turbulence of chi of heaven and earth was very terrible. Even the weakest talisman power seemed to have some special power when mixed in the turbulence that cut the space. Xiaoho stood in the middle of the sea storm of talisman power, and in the turbulence of the chi of heaven and earth. The emotions on his face were very complicated, a little sad and a little angry, because he clearly remembered that this was the secret method of using talisman power by his most loyal subordinate, military stream Gushi. He did not expect that Ninkei would use this method in the battle tonight. The cold snowy wind, the violent night wind, the scorching flames, the suffocating humidity, all kinds of completely different seal intents were squeezed together by an invisible hand. There was no reason, but it was so terrifying. Xiaoho clenched his fists with an indifferent expression. His tattered coat was torn and flew, revealing a brand new armor underneath. Then, with his extremely vigorous psyche power, he extracted what he needed from the turbulence of the chi of heaven and earth and condensed it on the surface of his body, forming an invisible but extremely strong invisible armor. The invisible chi of heaven and earth armor, together with the visible metal armor, tightly isolated him from the surrounding heaven and earth, and from the storm of talisman intent and the turbulence of chi. Xiaoho lifted his feet and walked among the yellow talismans that were flying all over the sky. The violent talisman intent kept hitting his body, making muffled sounds or sharp cutting sounds. Under the attack of the talisman, the armor on his body was sometimes covered with a thick layer of ice, and sometimes it was bright red and dazzling, as if it had been burned for 7 days and 7 nights. In order to resist the sea of talisman intent, his psyche power was slowly and irreversibly consumed, but the expression on his face still did not change at all, and his footsteps were still so stable. Xiaoho was very clear that Ninkei was the successor of Master Yen Sei, and was regarded as the future divine talisman master by the world, so he was very sure what he would face in the battle tonight. However, the number of talismans prepared by Ninkei was far more than what he had calculated before. What was more unexpected was that Ninkei would display all his talisman Taoism skills at the beginning of the battle. It should be known that a talisman master needed to touch the talisman with psyche power, and the distance that the psyche power could spread was congenitally limited. At this time, the lakeside house was full of flying talisman papers, which could only mean that Ninkei was in the house at this time. Xiaoho thought that Ninkei's approach was very confident, very proud, very arrogant, and also very idiotic. Any cultivator who fought with a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, but did not try to keep a distance was an idiot. Since Ninkei was by the lakeside, then he was not in a hurry to leave the sea of talisman storm. He let the talisman storm continue to consume his psyche power, because he wanted to find Ninkei and then kill him in one fell swoop. He continued to walk forward without any movement, and a gray wall in front of him suddenly collapsed. He looked at the deep night, looked at the faintly visible lake willows in the south of the house, and said with slight mockery, "If it is not a divine talisman, how can it hurt me? Since you are so eager to die, then die." Yinming Lake was irregular. The west bank of the lake was relatively narrow and far away. The lake water was clear and shallow. Someone built a wooden bridge across the lake, and people could enjoy the water plants in the lake. It was winter, and the wooden bridge was full of snow. The lake water under the bridge had all condensed into solid thick ice, and the green silk-like water plants could no longer be seen. Only a few yellow and white reeds swayed in the wind could be seen. In such cold weather, the imperial court had blocked the area around Yinming Lake, so naturally there were no tourists. However, there were a few people standing on both sides of the wooden bridge, looking at the west of the lake with different expressions. Yi Hongyu's green Taoist robe was a little loose, and it fluttered in the wind and snow. She looked at the lakeside house in the distance, and felt the talisman storm there. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She had lived in that house for a long time, but it was not until now that she knew what Ninkei had done in the house, and how many terrifying talisman papers he had hidden. The Tao addict was an extremely confident person, but she had to admit that if Ninkei used the talisman storm to deal with her, she would definitely be in an extremely difficult situation. On the other side of the wooden bridge, Chun Pippi held an oil paper umbrella in one hand, and held Tang Xiaotong's small hand in the other. He looked at the shining light in the distance from time to time in the west, and looked at the countless yellow papers dancing like a waterfall. He said in shock, "We all know that youngest brother is stingy, but who would have thought that he would make such an extravagant move tonight?" Tang Xiaotong's hand was a little cold. She was worried about her friend's current situation, and also shocked by the impact of the talisman papers by the lake. She murmured, "Talisman is such a terrible thing." On the cliff of the south bank of Yanming Lake, Ning Ke opened his eyes and looked at the talisman paper storm in the house on the other side of the lake. He heard the faint sound of the wall falling and the tiles flying. "I asked Seventh Sister to design the tactical array and the big black umbrella to make Xiaoho make a wrong judgment, to make him think that I am in the house. Xiaoho is actually very cautious and suspicious. On this basis he has abnormal confidence. Since he judged that I am there, he will definitely believe that I am there." He said sarcastically, "Maybe he is still taunting me at this time, asking me to come out and fight to my heart's content." Sang Sang looked at the other side of the lake and frowned. She said, "But his strength is too strong, and the talisman sea seems to be unable to deal with him. I never expected this talisman storm to directly defeat Xiaoho. After all, I am not a divine talisman master. The talisman papers I sprinkled in the flower pots may only become useless smoke on his armor like moths flying into the fire, but there may be talismans that can cut off one of his eyelashes." He continued, "A falling eyelash is nothing, and he may not even notice it himself, but many a little makes a mickle, and it can be fatal. Just like walking, as long as you keep walking, one day you will get to the place you want to go. Even if Xiaoho is an indestructible mountain and my method is an inconspicuous spoon, if I keep hitting it, even if I keep hitting it for a long time, this mountain will still be loosened by me. The surface of the mountain will loosen, the rocks will turn into powder and fall, and the mountain will collapse and the earth will shake." After saying this, Ning Ke handed the big black umbrella in his hand to Sang Sang. Sang Sang took the big black umbrella and looked at him. She said, "Yes, young master, you will definitely win." Ning Ke's psyche power was rapidly consumed by triggering hundreds of talismans at the same time across the lake. His face was a little pale, but his eyes were still calm. He looked at the other side of the lake and slowly raised his right arm. His fingers trembled uneasily, as if there was a heavy mountain hanging between his fingers with invisible strings. He slowly moved his right arm and drew 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines in the wind and snow in front of him. The invisible and dignified lines pointed to the house on the other side of Yanming Lake. In the house, the yellow paper that was dancing in the sky all turned into nothingness, and the dazzling light gradually faded. The violent and terrifying talisman intent was still constantly tearing the chi of heaven and earth. It was calm but contained danger. In the relatively sparse snowy night elsewhere in Chang, and for faint lines appeared. Those lines had no color and should be transparent and invisible, but they could be seen. The reason why the 4 lines could be seen was that the dancing snowflakes in the night sky suddenly fled in all directions. Some of the snowflakes that could not escape quietly turned into nothingness. The 4 lines in the night sky were traces of no snow. The 4 lines, 2 horizontal and 2 vertical, formed a Jing character. The violent talisman intent in the night sky all condensed in this Jing character. Well, both horizontal and vertical meant to cut. Jing Fu was the most terrifying and profound talisman intent of Master Yin Sei when he was alive. Before he perished together with the great divine priest of light at the top of the nameless mountain, the Jing Fu that he used could even cut the space and cut off the Haotian divine flame that the great divine priest of light obtained in the Tianqi state in the space. Ning Ke inherited all the mantle of Master Yin Sei, so he was naturally the most diligent in the study of Jing Fu. Although his state was not enough and he could not fully exert the power of Jing Fu, the Jing Fu he wrote was already powerful enough and was the most powerful talisman he could use now. And he didn't know when he could cast talismans in the indefinite form. This method was already close to the level of calligraphy addict Mo Shanshan in the wilderness. In other words, this well talisman was his half-divine talisman. Jing Fu fell from the night sky and covered the whole courtyard by the lake, as if there were countless smaller Jing Fu hidden in it, and nothing could escape. The plum blossoms were cut, the well was cut, the wall was cut, and everything was cut when the Jing Fu fell. The Jingfu, which was straight and sharp to the extreme, fell on Xiahou. On the surface of his body, the armor condensed by the qi of heaven and earth, there were 4 very clear marks slightly sunken, and the brand new armor inside had 4 rusty marks. Xiahou's dark face suddenly turned white, and then quickly turned red, then snow-white, and then flushed, changing rapidly. Psyche power came out. The qi of heaven and earth condensed on the surface of his body shook uneasily, sunk and bounced back, and finally supported the Jingfu, but it had become much thinner, like a piece of thin paper. Then a light sound came from his body, and the armor was broken into countless metal pieces along the 4 rusty lines, like broken copper and iron falling under his feet. Xiahou looked at the other side of Yinming Lake, looking at the dark night. Until then, he realized that he had been in the well, and Ning Ke had been outside the well. Last night I got a cold after drinking and blowing in the wind. I feel dizzy, my lips are blistered, and I feel suffocated. What I want to say is, I will write another chapter, hoping to improve my character. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Qidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.